Chapter 38 of The Inevitable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Hawryluk. The Inevitable by Louis COUPERUS. Translated by Alexander TEIXEIRA de MATTOS. The Inevitable, Chapter 38. Giulio hated the villeggiatura at San Stefano. Every morning he had to be up and dressed by 6 o'clock, with Prince Ercole, Urania and the Marchesa, to hear mass said by the chaplain in the private chapel of the castle. After that, he did not know what to do with his time. He had gone bicycling once or twice with Bob Hope, but the young Far Westerner had too much energy for him. Like Bob's sister Urania, he flirted and argued a little with Cornélie, but secretly he was still offended and angry with himself and her. He remembered her first arrival that evening at the Piazza Ruspoli, when she came and disturbed his rendezvous with Urania. And in the Camera degli Sposi she had for the second time been too much for him. He seethed with fury when he thought of it, and he hated her and swore by all his gods to be revenged. He cursed his own lack of resolution. He had been too weak to use violence or force, and there ought never to have been any need to resort to force. He was accustomed to quick surrender. And he had to be told by her, that Dutch woman, that his temperament did not respond to hers. What was there about that woman? What did she mean by it? He was so unaccustomed to thinking he was such a thoughtless, easy-going Italian child of nature, so accustomed to let his life run on according to his every whim and impulse, that he hardly understood her. Though he suspected the meaning of her words, hardly understood that reserve of hers. Why should she behave so to him, this foreigner with her demoniacal new ideas, who cared nothing about the world, who would have nothing to do with marriage, who lived with a painter as his mistress? She had no religion and no morals. He knew about religion and morals. She belonged to the devil. Demoniacal was what she was. Didn't she know all about Aunt Lucia Belloni's manoeuvres? And hadn't Aunt Lucia warned him lately that she was a dangerous woman, an uncanny woman, a woman of the devil? She was a witch. Why should she refuse? Hadn't he plainly seen her figure last night going through the courtyard in the moonlight, beside Van der Staal's figure? And hadn't he seen them opening the door that led to the terrace by the pergola? And hadn't he waited an hour, 2 hours without sleeping, until he saw them come back and lock the door after them? And why did she love only him, that painter? Oh, he hated him with all the blazing hatred of his jealousy. He hated her for her exclusiveness, for her disdain, for all her jesting and flirting, as though he were a buffoon, a clown. What was it that he asked? A favour of love, such as she granted her lover. He was not asking for anything serious, any oath or lifelong tie. He asked for so little, just 1 hour of love. It was of no importance. He had never looked upon that as of much importance. And she refused it to him. No, he did not understand her, but what he did understand was that she disdained him, and he hated the pair of them. And yet he was enamoured of her with all the violence of his thwarted passion, in the boredom of that villeggiatura to which his wife forced him in her new love for their ruined Airy. His hatred and the thought of his revenge formed an occupation for his empty brains. Outwardly he was the same as usual and flirted with Cornélie, flirted even more than usual, to annoy Van der Staal. and when his cousin, the Countess de Rosavilla, his white cousin, the lady-in-waiting to the queen, came to spend a few days with them, he flirted with her too, and tried to provoke Cornélie's jealousy. He failed in this, however, and consoled himself with the countess, who made up to him for his disappointment. She was no longer a young woman, but represented the cold, sculptured Juno type, with a rather foolish expression. She had Juno eyes protruding from their sockets. She was a leader of fashion at the Quirinal and in the white world, and her reputation for gallantry was generally known. She had never had a liaison with Gilio that lasted for longer than an hour. She had very simple ideas on love, without much variety. Her light-hearted depravity amused Gilio, and flirting in the corners, with his foot on hers under her skirt, Gilio told her about Cornélie, about Duco and about the adventure in the Camera degli Sposi, and asked his cousin whether she understood. No, the Countess di Rosavilla did not understand it any too well either. Temperament? Oh yes, perhaps she, questa Cornelia, preferred fair men to dark. There were women who had a preference. And Gilio laughed. It was so simple. L'amore. There wasn't very much to be said about it. Cornélie was glad that Gilio had the countess to amuse him. She and Duco interested themselves in Urania's plans. Duco had long talks with the architect, and he was indignant and advised him not to rebuild so much in that undistinguished restoration manner. It was lacking in style, cost heaps of money, and spoiled everything. Urania was disconcerted, but Duco went on, interrupted the architect, advised him to build up only what was actually falling to pieces, and, so far as possible, to confine himself to underpinning, reinforcing, and preserving. And one morning Prince Ercole deigned to walk through the long rooms with Duco, Urania, and Cornélie. There was a great deal to be done, Duco considered, by merely repairing and artistically arranging what at present stood thoughtlessly huddled together. "The curtains?" asked Urania. "Let them be," Duco considered. "At the most new window curtains. But the old red Venetian damask. Oh, let it be, let it be." It was so beautiful. Here and there it might be patched very carefully. He was horrified at Urania's notion. New curtains. And the old prince was enraptured, because in this way the restoration of San Stefano would cost thousands less and be more artistic. He regarded his daughter-in-law's money as his own and preferred it to her. He was enraptured. He took Duco with him to his library, showed him the old missals, the old family books and papers, charters and deeds of gifts, showed him his coins and medals. It was all out of order and neglected, first from lack of money and then from slighting indifference. But now Urania wanted to reorganize the family museum with the aid of experts from Rome, Florence and Bologna. The old prince's interest revived, now that there was money. And the experts came and stayed at the castle, and Duco spent whole mornings in their company. He enjoyed every moment of it. He lived in his enchantment of the past, no longer in the days of antiquity, but in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. The days were too short, and his love for San Stefano became such that one day an archivist took him for the young prince, for Prince Virgilio. At dinner that evening Prince Ercole told the story, and everybody laughed, but Gilio thought the joke beyond price, whereas the archivist, who was there at dinner, did not know how to apologize sufficiently. End of chapter 38. Chapter 39 of The Inevitable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Hawryluk. The Inevitable by COUPERUS. Translated by Alexander TEIXEIRA de MATTOS. The Inevitable, Chapter 39. Giulio had followed the advice of his cousin, the Countess di Rosavilla. Immediately after dinner he had stolen outside, and he walked along the pergola to the rotunda, into which the moonlight fell as into a white beaker. But there was a shadow behind a couple of caryatides, and here he hid. He waited for an hour. But the night slept, the caryatides slept, standing motionless and supporting the leafy roof. He uttered a curse and stole indoors again. He walked down the corridors on tiptoe and listened at Van der Staal's door. He heard nothing, but perhaps Van der Staal was asleep. Giulio, however, crept along another corridor and listened at Cornélie's door. He held his breath. Yes, there was sound of voices. They were together. He clenched his fists and walked away. But why did he excite himself? He knew all about their relations. Why should they not be together here? And he went on and tapped at the countess's door. Next evening he again waited in the rotunda. They did not come. But a few evenings later, as he sat waiting, choking with annoyance, he saw them come. He saw Duco lock the terrace door behind him. The rusty lock grated in the distance. Slowly he saw them walk along and approach in the light, disappearing from view in the shadow, reappearing in the moonlight. They sat down on the marble bench. How happy they seemed! He was jealous of their happiness, jealous above all of him. And how gentle and tender she was, she who considered him, Giulio, only good enough for her amusement, to flirt with, a clown. She, the devilish woman, was angelic to the man she loved. She bent towards her lover with a smiling caress, with a curve of her arm, with a proffering of her lips, with something intensely alluring, with a velvety languor of love which he would never have suspected in her, after her cold jesting flirtation with him, Giulio. She was now leaning on Duco's arms, on his breast, with her face against his. Oh, how her kiss filled Giulio with flame and fury! This was no longer her icy lack of sensuous response towards him, Giulio, in the Camera degli Sposi. And he could restrain himself no longer. He would at least disturb their moment of happiness. And quivering in every nerve, he stepped from behind the caryatides and went towards them, through the rotunda. Lost in each other's eyes, they did not see him at once. But suddenly, simultaneously, they both started. Their arms fell apart then and there. They sprang up in one movement. They saw him approaching, but evidently did not at once recognize him. Not until he was closer did they perceive who he was. And they looked at him in startled silence, wondering what he would say. He made a satirical bow. A delightful evening, isn't it? The view is lovely like this, at night, from the pergola. You are right to come and enjoy it. I hope that I am not disturbing you with my unexpected company." His tremulous voice sounded so spiteful and aggressive that they could not doubt the violence of his anger. "Not at all, Prince," replied Cornélie, recovering her composure. "Though I can't imagine what you are doing here at this hour." "And what are you doing here at this hour?" "What am I doing? I am sitting with Van der Staal." "At this hour? At this hour? What do you mean, Prince? What are you suggesting?" "What am I suggesting? that the pergola is closed at night. Prince, said Duco, your tone is offensive. And you are altogether offensive. If you were not my host, I would strike you in the face. Cornélie caught Duco by the arm. The prince cursed and clenched his fists. Prince, she said, you have obviously come to pick a quarrel with us. Why? What objection can you have to my meeting Van der Staal here in the evening? In the first place, our relations towards each other is no secret for you. And then I think it unworthy of you to come spying on us. Unworthy? Unworthy? He had lost all self-control. I am unworthy, am I? And petty and rude and not a man, and my temperament doesn't suit you? His temperament seems to suit you all right. I heard the kiss you gave him, she-devil, demon. Never have I been insulted as I have by you. I have never put up with so much from anybody. I will put up with it no more. You struck me, you demon, you she-devil. And now he's threatening to strike me. My patience is at an end. I can't bear that in my own house you should refuse me what you give to him. He is not your husband. He's not your husband. I have as much right to you as he. And if he thinks he has a better right than I, then I hate him. I hate him. And, blind with rage, he flew at Duco's throat. The attack was so unexpected that Duco stumbled. They both wrestled furiously. All their hidden antipathy broke forth in fury. They did not hear Cornélie's entreaties. They struck each other with their fists. They grappled with arms and legs, breast to breast. Then Cornélie saw something flash. In the moonlight she saw that the prince had drawn a knife. But the very movement was an advantage to Duco, who gripped his wrist as in a vice, forced him to the ground and, pressing his knee on Gilio's chest, took him by the throat with his other hand. Let go, yelled the prince. Let go that knife, yelled Duco. The prince obstinately persisted. Let go, he yelled once more. Let go that knife. The knife dropped from his fingers. Duco grasped it and rose to his feet. Get up, he said. We can continue this fight, if you like, tomorrow, under less primitive conditions, not with a knife, but with swords or pistols. The prince stood panting, blue in the face. When he came to himself, he said slowly, No, I will not fight a duel unless you want to, but I don't. I am defeated. She has a demoniacal force which would always make you win, whatever game we played. We've had our duel. This struggle tells me more than a regular duel would. Only, if you want to fight me, I have no objection. But I now know for certain that you would kill me. She protects you. I don't want to fight a duel with you, said Duco. Then let us look on this struggle as a duel, and now give me your hand. Duco put out his hand. Gilio pressed it. Forgive me, he said, bowing before Cornélie. I have insulted you. No, said she, I do not forgive you. We have to forgive each other. I forgive you the blow you struck me. I forgive you nothing. I shall never forgive you this evening's work. Not your spying, nor your lack of self-control, nor the rights which you try to claim from me, an unmarried woman, whereas I allowed you no rights whatsoever, nor your attack, nor your knife. Are we enemies then for good? Yes, for good. I shall leave your house tomorrow. I have done wrong, he confessed humbly. Forgive me, I am hot-blooded. Until now I looked upon you as a gentleman. I am also an Italian. I do not forgive you. I once proved to you that I could be a good friend. This is not the moment to remind me of it. I remind you of everything that might make you more gently disposed towards me. It is no use. Enemies then? Yes. Let us go indoors. I shall leave your house tomorrow. I will do any penance that you inflict upon me. I inflict nothing. I want this conversation to end and I want to go indoors. I will go ahead of you. They walked up the pergola. He himself opened the terrace door and let them in before him. They went in silence to their rooms. The castle lay asleep in the darkness. The prince struck a match to light the way. Duco was the first to reach his room. "I will light you to your room," said the prince meekly. He struck a second match and accompanied Cornélie to her door. Here he fell on his knees. "Forgive me," he whispered, with a sob in his throat. "No," she said. And without more she locked the door behind her. He remained on his knees for another moment. Then he slowly rose to his feet. His throat hurt him. His shoulder felt as though it were dislocated. "It's over," he muttered. "I am defeated. She is stronger now than I, but not because she is a devil. I have seen them together. I have seen their embrace. She is stronger, he is stronger than I. Because of their happiness, I feel that, because of their happiness, they will always be stronger than I." He went on to his room, which adjoined Urania's bedroom. His chest heaved with sobs. Dressed as he was, he flung himself sobbing on his bed, swallowing his sobs in the slumbering night that hung over the castle. Then he got up and looked out the window. He saw the lake. He saw the pergola where they had been fighting. The night was sleeping there. The Caryatides, sleeping, stood out white against the shadow. And his eyes sought the exact spot of their struggle and of his defeat. And, with this superstitious faith in their happiness, he became convinced that there would be no more fighting against it, ever. Then he shrugged his shoulders as if he were flinging a load off his back. "Fa niente," he said to console himself. "Domini megliori." And he meant that tomorrow he would achieve, if not this victory, another. Then, with his eyes still moist, he fell asleep like a child. End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of The Inevitable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Hawryluk. The Inevitable by COUPERUS, translated by Alexander TEIXEIRA de MATTOS. The Inevitable. Chapter 40. Urania sobbed nervously in Cornélie's arms when she told the young princess that she was leaving that morning. She and Duco were alone with Urania in Urania's own drawing room. "What has happened?" she sobbed. Cornélie told her of the previous evening. "Urania," she said seriously, "I know I am a coquette. I thought it pleasant to talk with Gilio. Call it flirting if you like. I never made a secret of it, either to Duco or to you. I looked upon it as an amusement, nothing more. Perhaps I did wrong. I know it annoyed you once before. I promise not to do it again. But it seems to be beyond my control. It's in my nature, and I shall not attempt to defend myself. I look upon it as a trifle, as a diversion, as fun. But perhaps it was wrong. Do you forgive me? I have grown so fond of you. It would hurt me if you did not forgive me. Make it up with Gilio and stay on." "That's impossible, my dear girl. Gilio has insulted me. Gilio drew his knife against Duco, and those are two things which I can never forgive him. So it is impossible for us to remain." "I shall be so lonely," she sobbed. "I also am so fond of you. I'm fond of you both. Is there no way out of it? Bob is going tomorrow too. I shall be all alone, and I have nothing here, nobody who is fond of me. You have a great deal left, Urania. You have an object in life. You can do any amount of good in your surroundings. You are interested in the castle, which is now your own. It's all so empty, she sobbed. It means nothing to me. I need affection. Who is there that is fond of me? I have tried to love Gilio, and I do love him, but he doesn't care for me. Nobody cares for me. Your poor are devoted to you. You have a noble aim in life. I'm glad of it, but I am too young to live only for an aim. And I have nothing else. Nobody cares for me. Prince Ercole, surely. No, he despises me. Listen, I told you once before what Gilio said, that there were no family jewels, that they were all sold. You remember, don't you? Well, there are family jewels. I gathered that from something that the Countess di Rosavilla said. There are family jewels, but Prince Ercole keeps them in the Banco di Roma. They despise me, and I am not thought good enough to wear them. And to me they pretend that there are none left. And the worst of it is that all their friends, all their set know that the jewels are there, in the bank, and they all say that Prince Ercole is right. My money is good enough for them, but I'm not good enough for their old jewels, the jewels of their grandmother. That's a shame, said Cornélie. It's the truth, sobbed Urania. Oh, do make it up. Stay a little longer for my sake. Judge for yourself, Urania. We really can't. I suppose you're right, she admitted with a sigh. It's all my fault. No, no. Gilio is sometimes so impetuous. But his impetuousness, his anger, his jealousy are my fault. I'm sorry about it, Urania. Because of you. Forgive me. Come and look me up in Rome when you go back. Don't forget me, and write, won't you? Now I must go and pack my trunk. What time is the train? 10:25, said Duco. We shall go together. Can I say good-bye to Prince Ercole? Send and ask if he can see me. What shall I tell him? The first thing that comes into your head, that a friend of mine in Rome is ill, that I am going to look after her, and that Van der Staal is taking me back because I am nervous travelling. I don't care what Prince Ercole thinks. Cornélie, darling, I really haven't another moment. Kiss me and forgive me, and think of me sometimes. Goodbye. We've had a delightful time together, and I have grown very fond of you. She tore herself from Urania's embrace. Duco also said goodbye. They left the princess sobbing by herself. In the passage they met Gilio. Where are you going? He asked in his humble voice. We are going by the 10:25. I am very, very sorry. But they went on and left him standing there, while Urania sat sobbing in the drawing room. End of chapter 40. Chapter 41 of The Inevitable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Hawryluk. The Inevitable by Louis COUPERUS. Translated by Alexander TEIXEIRA de MATTOS. The Inevitable. Chapter 41. In the train, in the scorching morning heat, they were silent, and they found Rome as it were bursting out of its houses in the blazing sunshine. The studio, however, was cool, solitary, and peaceful. Cornélie, said Duco, tell me what happened between you and the prince. Why did you strike him? She pulled him down on the sofa, threw herself on his neck, and told him the incident of the Camera degli Sposi. She told him of the 1,000 lire and the bracelet. She explained that she had said nothing about it before, so as not to speak to him of financial worries while he was finishing his watercolour for the exhibition in London. "Duco," she continued, "I was so frightened when I saw Gilio draw that knife yesterday. It felt as if I was going to faint, but I didn't. I had never seen him like that, so violent, so ready to do anything. It was then that I really felt how much I loved you. I should have murdered him if he had wounded you." "You ought not to have played with him," he said severely. "He loves you." But, in spite of his stern voice, he drew her closer to him. Filled with a certain consciousness of guilt, she laid her head coaxingly on his chest. "He is only a little in love," she said, defending herself feebly. "He is very passionately in love. You ought not to have played with him." She made no further reply, merely stroked his face with her hand. She liked him all the better for reproaching her as he did. She loved that stern, earnest voice which he hardly ever adopted towards her. She knew that she had that need for flirting in her, that she had had it ever since she was a very young girl. It did not count with her, it was only innocent fun. She did not agree with Duco, but thought it unnecessary to go over the whole ground. It was as it was, she didn't think about it, didn't dispute it, it was like a difference of opinion, almost of taste, which did not count. She was lying against him too comfortably, after the excitement of last evening, after a sleepless night, after a precipitate departure, after 3 hours of railway travelling in the blazing heat, to argue to any extent. She liked the silent coolness of the studio, the sense of being alone with him, after her 3 weeks at San Stefano. There was a peacefulness here, a return to herself, which filled her with bliss. The tall window was open and the warm air poured in beneficently and was tempered by the natural chilliness of the north room. Duco's easel stood empty, awaiting him. This was their home, amid all that colour and form of art which surrounded them. She now understood that colour and form. She was learning Rome. She was learning it all in dreams of happiness. She gave little thought to the woman question and hardly glanced at the notices of her pamphlet, taking but a scanty interest in them. She admired Lippo's Angel, admired the panel of Gentile de Fabriano and the resplendent colours of the old chasubles. It was very little, after the treasure at San Stefano, but it was theirs and it was home. She did not speak, felt happy and contented resting on Duco's breast and passing her fingers over his face. "The Banners is as good as sold," he said. "For £90. I shall telegraph to London to day, and then we shall soon be able to pay the prince back that 1,000 lire." "It's Urania's money," she said feebly. "But I won't have that debt hanging on." She felt that he was a little angry, but she was in no mood to discuss money matters, and she was filled with a blissful languor as she lay on his breast. "Are you cross, Duco?" "No, but you oughtn't to have done it." He clasped her more tightly, to make her feel that he did not want to grumble at her, even though he thought she had done wrong. She thought that she had done right not to mention the 1,000 lire to him, but she did not defend herself. It meant useless words, and she felt too happy to talk about money. "Cornélie," he said, "let us get married." She looked at him in dismay, startled out of her blissfulness. "Why?" "Not because of ourselves, we are just as happy unmarried. But because of the world, because of people." Because of the world? Because of people? Yes, we shall be feeling more and more isolated. I discussed it once or twice with Urania. She was very sorry about it, but she sympathized with us and wasn't shocked. She thought it an impossible position. Perhaps she is right. We can't go anywhere. At San Stefano they still acted as though they did not know that we were living together. But that is over now. What do you care about the opinion of small, insignificant people who chance to cross your path, as you yourself say? It's different now. We owe the prince money, and Urania is the only friend you have." "I have you. I don't want anyone else." He kissed her. "Really, Cornélie, it is better that we should get married. Then nobody can insult you again as the prince dared to do. He has narrow-minded notions. How can you want to get married for the sake of a world and people like San Stefano and the prince? The whole world is like that, without exception, and we are in the world. We live in the midst of other people. It is impossible to isolate one's self entirely, and isolation brings its own punishment later. We have to attach ourselves to other people. It is impossible always to lead your own existence, without any sense of community. Duco, how you've changed! These are the ideas of ordinary society. I have been reflecting more lately. I am just learning how not to reflect, my darling. How grave you are this morning. And this while I am lying up against you so deliciously, to rest after all that excitement and the hot journey. Seriously, Cornélie, let us get married." She snuggled against him a little nervously, displeased because he persisted and because he was forcibly dissipating her blissful mood. "You're a horrid boy. Why need we get married? It would alter nothing in our position. We still shouldn't trouble about other people. We are living so delightfully here, living for your art. We want nothing more than each other and your art and Rome. I'm so very fond of Rome now. I am quite altered. There is something here that is always attracting me afresh. At San Stefano I felt homesick for Rome and for our studio. You must choose a new subject and get to work again. When you're doing nothing, you sit thinking about social ethics. And that doesn't suit you at all. It makes you so different. And then such petty, conventional ideas. To get married? Why, in heaven's name, should we, Duco? You know my views on marriage. I have had experience. It is better not." She had risen and was mechanically looking through some half-finished sketches in a portfolio. "Your experience," he repeated. "We know each other too well to be afraid of anything." She took the sketches from the portfolio. They were ideas which had occurred to him and which he had jotted down while he was working at the banners. She examined them and scattered them abroad. "Afraid?" she repeated vaguely. "No," she suddenly resumed more firmly. "A person never knows himself or another. I don't know you. I don't know myself." Something deep down within herself was warning her. "Don't marry. Don't give in. It's better not. It's better not." It was barely a whisper, a shadow of premonition. She had not thought it out. It was unconscious and mysterious as the depths of her soul. For she was not aware of it, she did not think it, she hardly heard it within herself. It flitted through her. It was not a feeling. It only left a thwarting reluctance in her, very plainly. Not until years later would she understand that unwillingness. "No, Duco, it is better not." "Think it over, Cornélie." "It is better not," she repeated obstinately. "Please, don't let us talk about it any more. It's better not, but I think it so horrid to refuse you because you want it. I never refused you anything, as you know. I would do anything else for you, but this time I feel it is better not." She went to him, all one caress, and kissed him. "Don't ask it of me again. What a cloud on your face. I can see that you mean to go on thinking of it." She stroked his forehead as though to smooth away the wrinkles. "Don't think of it any more. I love you. I love you. I want nothing but you. I am happy as we are. Why shouldn't you be too? Because Gilio was rude and Urania prim? Come and look at your sketches. Will you be starting work soon? I love it when you're working. Then I'll write something again, a chat about an old Italian castle, my recollections of San Stefano, perhaps a short story with the pergola for a background. Oh, that beautiful pergola! But yesterday, that knife. Tell me, Duco, are you going to work again? Let's look through them together. What a lot of ideas you had at that time. But don't become too symbolical. I mean, don't get into habits, into tricks. Don't repeat yourself. This woman here is very good. She is walking so unconsciously down that shelving line. And all those hands pushing around her. And those red flowers in the abyss. Tell me, Duco, what had you in your mind?" "I don't know. It was not very clear to myself. I think it very good. But I don't like this sketch. I can't say why. There's something dreary in it. I think the woman stupid. I don't like those shelving lines. I like lines that go up, as in the banners, that all flow out of darkness upward toward the sun. How beautiful that was! What a pity that we no longer have it, that it is being sold. If I were a painter I should never be able to part with anything. I shall keep the sketches, to remind me of it. Don't you think it dreadful that we no longer have it?" He agreed. He also loved and missed his banners. And he hunted with her among the other studies and sketches. But apart from the unconscious woman, there was nothing that was clear enough to him to elaborate. And Cornélie would not have him finish the unconscious woman. No, she didn't like those shelving lines. But after that he found some sketches of landscape studies, of clouds and skies over the Campagna, Venice and Naples. And he set to work. End of chapter 41. Chapter 42 of The Inevitable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Hawryluk. The Inevitable by COUPERUS. Translated by Alexander Teixeira de Mattos. The Inevitable, Chapter 42. They were very economical. They had a little money, and all through the scorching Roman summer the months passed as in a dream. They went on living their lonely, happy life without seeing anyone except Urania, who came to Rome now and again, looked them up, lunched with them at the studio, and went back again in the evening. Then Urania wrote to them that Gilio could stand it no longer at San Stefano, and that they were going abroad, first to Switzerland and then to Ostend. She came once more to say good-bye, and after that they saw nobody. In the old days Duco had known an artist here and there, a fellow countryman painting in Rome. Now he knew nobody, saw nobody. And their life in the cool studio was like life in a lonely oasis amid the torrid desert of Rome in August. For economy's sake they did not go into the mountains, to a cooler spot. They spent no more than was absolutely necessary. And none the less this bohemian poverty, in its coloured setting of triptych and chasuble, spelt happiness. Money, however, remained scarce. Duco sold a watercolor once in a way, but at times they had to resort to the sale of a curio, and it always went to Duco's heart to part with anything that he had collected. They had few needs, but the time would come when the rent of the studio fell due. Cornélie sometimes wrote an article or a sketch and bought out of the proceeds what she needed for her wardrobe. She possessed a certain knack of putting on her clothes, a talent for looking smart in an old, worn blouse. She was fastidious about her hair, her skin, her teeth, her nails. With a new veil she would wear an old hat, with an old walking dress a pair of fresh gloves. And she wore everything with a certain air of smartness. At home, in her pink tea gown, which had lost its colour, the lines of her figure were so charming that Duco was constantly sketching her. They hardly ever went to a restaurant now. Cornélie cooked something at home, invented easy recipes, fetched a fiasco of wine from the nearest olio e vino, where the cab drivers sat drinking at little tables, and they dined better and more cheaply than at the osteria. And Duco, now that he no longer bought things from the dealer in antiques on the Tiber, spent nothing at all. But money remained scarce. Once, when they had sold a silver crucifix for far less than it was worth, Cornélie was so dejected that she sobbed on Duco's breast. He consoled her, caressed her, and declared that he didn't care much about the crucifix. But she knew that the crucifix was a very fine piece of work by an unknown 16th century artist, and that he was very unhappy at losing it. And she said to him seriously that it could not go on like this, that she could not be a burden to him, and that they had better part, that she would look about for something to do, that she would go back to Holland. He was alarmed by her despair and said that it was not necessary, that he was able to look after her as his wife, but that unfortunately he was such an unpractical fellow, who could do nothing but splash about a bit with watercolors, and even that not well enough to live on. But she said that he must not talk like that. He was a great artist. It was just that he did not possess a facile, money-making fertility, but he ranked all the higher on that account. She said that she would not live on his money, that she wanted to keep herself. And she collected the scattered remnants of her feminist ideas. Once again he begged her to consent to their marriage. They would become reconciled with his mother, and Mrs. van der Staal would give him what she used to give him when he used to live with her at Belloni's. But she refused to hear either of marriage or of an allowance from his mother, even as he refused to take money from Urania. How often had Urania not offered to help them? He had never consented. He was even angry when Urania had given Cornélie a blouse which Cornélie accepted with a kiss. No, it couldn't go on like this. They had better part. She must go back to Holland and seek employment. It was easier in Holland than abroad. But he was so desperate, because of their happiness, which tottered before his eyes, that he held her tightly pressed to his breast, and she sobbed with her arms around his neck. Why should they part, he asked. They would be stronger together. He could no longer do without her. His life, if she left him, would be no life. He used to live in his dreams. He now lived in the reality of their happiness. And things remained as they were. They could not alter anything. They lived as thriftily as possible, in order to keep together. He finished his landscapes and always sold them, but he sold them at once, much too cheaply, so as not to have to wait for the money. But then poverty threatened once more, and she thought of writing to Holland. As it happened, however, she received a letter from her mother, followed by one from one of her sisters. And they asked her in those letters if it was true, what people were saying at the Hague, that she was living with Van der Staal. She had always looked upon herself as so far from the Hague and from Hague people that it had never occurred to her that her way of life might become known. She met nobody, she knew nobody with Dutch connections. Anyhow, her independent attitude was now known, and she answered the letters in a feminist tone, declared her dislike of marriage and admitted that she was living with Van der Staal. She wrote coldly and succinctly, so as to give those people at the Hague the impression that she was a free and independent woman. They knew her pamphlet there, of course, but she understood that she could now no longer think of Holland. She gave up her family as hopeless. Still it tore something in her, the unconscious family tie. But that tie was already greatly loosened, through lack of sympathy, especially at the time of her divorce, and she felt all alone. She had only her happiness, her lover, Duco. Oh, it was enough for all her life. If only she could make a little money. But how? She went to the Dutch consul, asked his advice. The visit led to nothing. She was not suited for a nurse. She wanted to earn money at once and had no time for training. She could serve in a shop, of course, and she applied without saying anything to Duco. But, notwithstanding her worn cloak, they thought her too much of a lady wherever she went, and she thought the salary too small for a whole day's work. And, when she felt that she had it in her blood to work for her bread, despite all her ideas and all her logic, despite her pamphlet and her independent womanhood, she felt helpless to the point of despair and, as she went home, weary, exhausted by climbing many stairs and by useless conversations and appeals, the old plaint rose to her lips. "Oh God, tell me what to do." End of chapter 42. Chapter 43 of The Inevitable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Hawryluk. The Inevitable by COUPERUS. Translated by Alexander Teixeira de Mattos. The Inevitable. Chapter 43. She wrote regularly to Urania in Switzerland, at Ostend, and Urania always wrote back very kindly and offered her assistance. But Cornélie always declined, afraid of hurting Duco. She, for herself, felt no such scruples, especially now that it was being borne in upon her that she would not be able to work. But she understood those scruples in Duco and respected them. For her own part, however, she would have accepted help, now that her pride was wavering, now that her ideas were falling to pieces. Too weak to withstand the steady pressures of life's hardships. It was like a great finger that just passed along a house of cards. Though built up with care and pride, everything fell flat at the least touch. The only things that stood firm and unshakable amidst the ruins were her love and her happiness. Oh, how she loved him! How simple was their happiness! How dear he was to her for his gentleness, his calmness, his lack of irritability, as though his nerves were strung only to the finer sensibilities of the artist. She felt so deliciously that it was all imperturbable, that it was all settled for good. Without that happiness they could never have dragged their difficult life along from day to day. Now she did not feel that burden every day, as though they were dragging the load along from one day to the next. She now felt it only sometimes, when the future was quite dark and they did not know whether they were dragging the burden of their lives, in the dusk of that future. But they always triumphed again. They loved each other too well to sink under the load. They always found a little more courage. Smiling, they supported each other's strength. September came, and October, and Urania wrote that they were coming back to San Stefano, to spend a couple of months there before going for the winter to Nice. And one morning Urania arrived unexpectedly in the studio. She found Cornélie alone. Duco had gone to an art dealer's. They exchanged affectionate greetings. "I'm so glad to see you again," Urania prattled gaily. "I'm glad to be back in Italy and to put in a little more time at San Stefano." "And is everything as it used to be, in your cosy studio? Are you happy? Oh, I need not ask." And she hugged and kissed Cornélie like a child, still lacking the strength of mind to condemn her friend's too free existence, especially now, after her own summer at Ostend. They sat beside each other on the couch, Cornélie in her old tea gown, which she wore with her own peculiar grace, and the young princess in her pale grey tailor-made, which clung to her figure in a very up-to-date manner and rustled with heavy silk lining, and a hat with black feathers and silver spangles. Her jewelled fingers toyed with a very long watch chain which she wore round her neck, the latest freak of fashion. Cornélie was able to admire without feeling envious, and made Urania stand up and turn round in front of her, approved of the cut of her skirt, said that the hat looked sweet on her, and examined the watch chain attentively. And she plunged into these matters of chiffons. Urania described the dresses at Ostend. Urania admired Cornélie's old tea gown. Cornélie smiled. "Especially after Ostend, eh?" She laughed merrily. But Urania meant it seriously. Cornélie wore it with such chic. And, changing the topic, she said that she wanted to speak very seriously, that perhaps she knew of something for Cornélie, now that Cornélie would never accept her, Urania's assistance. At Ostend she had made the acquaintance of an old American lady, Mrs. Uxeley, a regular type. She was 90 years of age and lived at Nice in the winter. She was fabulously rich, an oil queen's fortune. She was 90, but still behaved as if she was 45. She dined out, went into society, flirted. People laughed at her, but accepted her because of her money and her splendid entertainments. All the cosmopolitan colony visited her at Nice. Urania produced an Ostend casino paper and read out a journalistic account of a ball at Ostend, in which Mrs. Uxeley was called la femme la plus élégante d'Ostende. The journalist had been paid so much for it. Everybody laughed and was amused by it. Mrs. Uxeley was a caricature, but with enough tact to get herself taken seriously. Well, Mrs. Uxeley was looking for somebody. She always had a lady companion with her, a girl, a young woman, and already numberless ladies had succeeded one another in her employ. She had had cousins living with her, distant cousins, very distant cousins, and total strangers. She was tiresome, capricious, impossible. Everybody knew that. Would Cornélie care to try it? Urania had already discussed it with Mrs. Uxeley and recommended her friend. Cornélie did not feel greatly attracted, but thought it worth thinking over. Mrs. Uxeley's companion was staying on till November, when the old thing went back through Paris to Nice. And at Nice they would see so much of each other, Cornélie and Urania. But Cornélie thought it terrible to leave Duco. She did not think that it would ever work. They were so attached to each other, so used to each other. From the money point of view it would be excellent. an easy life which attracted her after that blow to her moral pride. But she could not think of leaving Duco. And what would Duco do at Nice? No, she couldn't. She simply couldn't. She must stay with him. She felt a reluctance to go, like a hand that withheld her. She told Urania to put the old lady off, to let her look out for somebody else. She could not do it. What use to her was such a life, socially dependent, though financially independent, without Duco? And when Urania was gone, she was going on to San Stefano. Cornélie was glad that she had at once declined that stupid, easy life of dependence as companion to a rich old dotard. She glanced round the studio. She loved it with its precious colours, its noble antiques, and, behind that curtain, her bed, behind that screen, her olive stove, making the space look like a little kitchen, with the bohemianism of its precious bibelots and very primitive comforts. It had become indispensable to her, had become her home. And when Duco came in, she kissed him and told him about Urania and Mrs. Uxeley. She was glad to be able to nestle in his arms. He had sold a couple of watercolours. There was no reason whatever to leave him. He didn't wish it either. He never would wish it. And they held each other tightly embraced, as though they were conscious of something that would be able to part them. An ineluctable necessity, as if hands hovered over them, pushing them, guiding them, opposing and inhibiting them. A contest of hands, like a cloud around them both. Hands that strove by main force to sunder their radiant path of life, their coalescent line of life, as if it were too narrow for the feet of the two of them, and the hands were trying to wrench it asunder, in order to let the broad track wind apart in two curves. They said nothing. Clasped in each other's arms, they gazed at life, shuddered at the hands, felt the approaching constraint which already was clouding more closely around them. But they felt warmth in each other's company. They locked up their little happiness tightly in their embrace and hid it between them, so that the hands might not point to it, touch it and thrust it aside. And under their fixed gaze life softly receded, the cloud dispersed, the hands faded away and disappeared, and their breasts heaved a sigh of relief, while she still remained lying against him and closed her eyes as though in a sleep. End of chapter 43. Chapter 44 of The Inevitable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Hawryluk. The Inevitable by COUPERUS, translated by Alexander Teixeira de Mattos. The Inevitable, chapter 44. But the life of constraint returned. The hovering hands reappeared, like a gentle, mysterious force. Cornélie wept bitterly and admitted to herself and admitted to Duco. It could not go on any longer. At one moment they had not enough to pay the rent of the studio and had to apply to Urania. Gaps showed in the studio. Colours vanished, owing to the sale of things which Duco had collected with love and sacrifice. But Lippo Mimi's angel, whom he refused to sell, still shone as of old, still holding forth the lily in his gown of gold brocade. Around him on every side yawned melancholy spaces, with bare nails showing in the walls. At first they tried to hang other things in the place of those which had gone, but they soon lost the inclination. And as they sat side by side in each other's arms, conscious of their little happiness, but also of the constraint of life with its pushing hands, they closed their eyes that they might no longer see the studio which seemed to be crumbling about them, while in the first cooler days a sunlit chill descended shivering from the ceiling, which seemed higher and farther away. The easel stood waiting, empty, and they both closed their eyes and thus remained, feeling that, despite the strength of their happiness and their love, they were gradually conquered by life, which persisted in its tyranny and day by day took something from them. Once, while they were sitting thus, their arms relaxed and their embrace fell away, as though hands were drawing them apart. They remained sitting for a long time, side by side, without touching each other. Then she sobbed aloud and flung herself with her face on his knees. There was no more to be done. Life was too strong for them, speechless life, the life of the soft, persistent constraint, which surrounded them with so many hands. Their little happiness seemed to be escaping them, like an angelic child that was dying and sinking out of their embrace. She said that she would write to Urania. The Forte Bracios were at Nice. He listlessly assented, and, as soon as she received a reply, she mechanically packed her trunk, packed up her old clothes, for Urania wrote and told her to come, said that Mrs. Uxeley wanted to see her. Mrs. Uxeley sent her the money for her journey. She was in a desperate strait of constant nervous sobbing, and she felt as if she were being torn from him, torn from that home which was dear to her and which was crumbling about her, all through her fault. When she received the registered letter with the money, she had a nervous attack, complaining to him like a child that she couldn't leave him, that she wouldn't leave him, that she could not live without him, that she loved him forever, forever, for she would die so far away from him. She lay on the sofa, her arms stiff, her legs stiff, crying out with a mouth distorted as though by physical pain. He took her in his arms and soothed her, bathed her forehead, gave her ether to drink, comforted her, said that everything would be all right again, later. Later? She looked at him vacantly. She was half mad with grief. She tossed everything out of the trunk again, all about the room, underclothing, blouses, and laughed and laughed. He conjured her to control herself. When she saw his frightened face, when he too began to sob on her breast, she drew him tightly to her, kissed him and comforted him in her turn. And everything in her became dullness and lethargy. Together they packed the trunk again. Then she looked around and, in a gust of energy, arranged the studio for him, had her bed taken away, pinned his own sketches to the walls, tried to build up something of what had gone to pieces around them, rearranged everything, did her best. She cooked their last meal. She made up the fire. But a desperate threat of loneliness and desertion reigned over everything. It was all wrong. It was all wrong. Sobbing, they fell asleep in each other's arms, close against each other. Next morning he took her to the station, and, when she had stepped into her compartment, they both of them lost all their self-control. They embraced each other sobbing, while the guard was waiting to lock the door. And she saw Duco run away like a madman, pushing his way through the crowd. And, broken with misery, she threw herself back into her seat. She was so ill and distressed, so near to fainting, that a lady beside her came to her aid and bathed her face in eau de cologne. She thanked the lady, apologized for the trouble she had given and, seeing the other passengers staring at her with compassionate eyes, she mastered herself, sat huddled in her corner and gazed vacantly through the window. She went on, stopping nowhere, only alighting to change trains. Though hungry, she had not the energy to order food at the stations. She ate nothing and drank nothing. She travelled a day and a night and arrived at Nice late the following evening. Urania was at the station and was startled to see Cornélie look grey and sallow, dead tired with hollow eyes. And she was most charming. She took Cornélie home with her, looked after her for some days, made her stay in bed, and went herself to tell Mrs. Uxeley that her friend was too unwell to report herself. Gilio came for a moment to pay Cornélie his respects, and she could not do other than thank him for these days of hospitality and care under his roof. And the young princess was like a sister, was like a mother, and fed Cornélie up with milk and eggs and strengthening medicines. Cornélie let her do as she liked, remained limp and indifferent and ate to please Urania. After a few days, Urania said that Mrs. Uxeley was coming to call that afternoon, being anxious to see her new companion. Mrs. Uxeley was alone now, but could wait until Cornélie's recovery. Cornélie dressed herself as well as she could, and with Urania awaited the old lady's arrival. She entered gushingly, with a torrent of words, and, in a dim light of Urania's drawing room, Cornélie was unable to realize that she was 90 years old. Urania winked at Cornélie, who only smiled faintly in return. She was afraid of this first interview. But Mrs. Uxeley, no doubt because Cornélie was a friend of the Princess di Forte Braccio, was very easy-mannered, very pleasant and free of all condescension towards her future companion. She inquired after Cornélie's health in a wearisome profusion of little exclamations and sentences and bits of advice. Cornélie, in the twilight of the lace-shaded standard lamps, took her in with a glance and saw a woman of 50, with the little wrinkles carefully powdered over, in a mauve velvet gown embroidered with dull gold and spangles and beads. On the brown wave chignon was a hat with a white aigrette. Her jewels kept on sparkling because she was very fussy, very restless in her movements. She now took Cornélie's hands and began to talk more confidentially. So Cornélie would come the day after tomorrow. Very well. She was accustomed to pay $100 a month, or 500 francs, never less, but also never more. But she could understand that Cornélie would want something now, for new clothes. Would she order what she wanted at this address and have it put down to Mrs. Uxeley's account? A couple of ball dresses, 2 or 3 less dressy evening frocks, in short, everything. The Princess Urania would tell her all about it and would go with her. And she rose, affecting the young woman, simpering through her long-handled lorgnette, but meanwhile leaning hard on her sunshade, working herself with a muscular effort along the stick of her sunshade, with a sudden twitch of rheumatism which uncovered all sorts of wrinkles. Urania saw her to the hall and came back shrieking with laughter, and Cornélie also laughed, but only listlessly. She didn't really care. She was more amazed at Mrs. Uxeley than amused. 90 years old. What an energy, worthy of a better object, to remain elegant. La femme la plus élégante de Ostende. 90 years old. How the woman must suffer, during the hours of her long toilette, while she was being made up into that caricature. Urania said it was all false, the hair, the bust. And Cornélie felt a loathing at having to live for the future beside this woman, as though beside an ignominy. In the happiness of her love, a great part of her energy had become relaxed, as though her dual happiness, Duco's and hers, had unfitted her for any future struggle for life and diminished her zest for life. But it had refined and purified something in her soul, and she loathed the sight of so much show for so vain and petty an object. And it was only necessity itself, the inevitability of the things of life, which urged and pushed her with a guiding finger along a line of life now winding solitary before her, that gave her the strength to hide within herself her sorrow, her longing, her nostalgia for everything that she had left behind. She did not talk about it to Urania. Urania was so glad to see her, looked upon her as a good friend, in the loneliness of her stately life, in her isolation among her aristocratic acquaintances. Urania accompanied her enthusiastically to dressmakers' establishments and shops and helped her to choose her new outfit. She did not care about it at all, she, an elegant woman, a woman of innate elegance, who in her outward appearance had always fought against poverty and who, in the days of her happiness, was able, with the aid of a fresh ribbon, to wear an old blouse gracefully, was utterly indifferent to everything that she was now buying on Mrs. Uxeley's account. To her it was as though these things were not for her. She let Urania ask and choose, she approved of everything. She allowed herself to be fitted as though she had been a doll. She greatly disliked having to spend money at a stranger's expense. She felt lowered and humiliated. All her haughty pride of life was gone. She was afraid of what they would say of her in the circle of Mrs. Uxeley's friends, afraid lest they knew of her independent ideas, of her cohabitation with Duco, afraid of Mrs. Uxeley's opinion. For Urania had had to be honest and tell everything. It was only on Urania's eager recommendation that she had been taken by Mrs. Uxeley. She felt out of place now that she would once more dare to play her part among all those people. And she was afraid of giving herself away. She would have to make believe, to conceal her ideas, to pick her words, and she was no longer accustomed to doing so. And all for that money. All because she had not had the energy, living with Duco, to earn her own bread and, gaily, independently, to cheer him in his work, in his art. Oh, if she could only have managed to do that, how happy she would have been! If only she had not allowed the wretched languor that was in her blood to increase within her like a morbid growth. The languor of her upbringing, her superficial, showy, drawing-room education, which had unfitted her for everything whatsoever. By temperament she was a creature of love as well as a woman of sensuousness and luxury, but there was more of love in her than of luxury. She would be happy under the simplest conditions if only she was able to love. And now life had torn her away from him, gradually but inexorably. And now her sensuous, luxurious nature was gratified, but in dependence. Yet it no longer satisfied her cravings, because she could not satisfy her soul. In that lonely soul a miserable dissatisfaction sprang up like a riotous growth. Her only happiness was his letters, letters of longing but also letters of comfort. He wrote expressing his longing, but he also wrote enjoining courage and hope. He wrote to her every day. He was now at Florence, seeking his consolation in the Uffizi, in the Pitti Palace. He had found it impossible to stay in Rome. The studio was now locked up. At Florence he was a little nearer to her, and his letters were to her a love story, the only novel that she read, and it was as though she saw his landscapes in his style, the same dim blending of colour and emotion, the pearly white, misty, dreamy distances filled with light, the horizon of his longing, as though his eyes were ever gazing at the vista in which she, on the night of departure, had vanished as in a mauve-grey sunset, a sky of dreary Campagna. In those letters they still lived together. But she could not write to him in this strain. Though she wrote to him daily, she wrote briefly, telling him ever the same things in other words, her longing, her weary indifference. But she wrote of the happiness which she derived from his letters, which were her daily bread. She was now with Mrs. Uxeley and occupied in the gigantic villa 2 charming rooms overlooking the sea and the Promenade des Anglais. Urania had helped her to arrange them. And she lived in an unreal dream of strangeness, of non-existence alone with her soul, of unlived actions and gestures, performed according to the will of others. In the morning she went to Mrs. Uxeley's in her boudoir and read her the French and American papers and sometimes a few pages of a French novel. She humbly did her best. Mrs. Uxeley thought that she read very nicely. Only she said that Cornélie must cheer up a bit, that her melancholy days were over now. Duco was never mentioned and Mrs. Uxeley behaved as though she knew nothing. The great boudoir looked through the open balcony windows over the sea, where, on the promenade, the morning stroll was already beginning, with the gaudy colours of the parasols striking a shrill note against the deep blue sea, an expensive sea, a costly tide, waves that seemed to exact a mint of money before they would consent to roll up prettily. The old lady, already painted, bedizened and bewigged, with a white lace wrap over her wig against the draught, lay in the black and white lace of her white silk tea gown on the piled up cushions of her sofa. In her wrinkled hand she held the lorgnette, with her initials in diamonds, through which it amused her to peer at the shrill patches of the parasols outside. Now and then, when her rheumatism gave a twinge, she suddenly distorted her face into one great crease of wrinkles, under which the smooth enamel of her make-up almost cracked, like crackled china. In the daylight she seemed hardly alive, looked like an automatic, jointed, stiff-limbed doll, which spoke and moved mechanically. She was always a trifle tired in the morning, for never sleeping at night. After 11 she took a little nap. She observed a strict regime, and her doctor, who called daily, seemed to revive her a little every day, to enable her to hold out until the evening. In the afternoon she drove out, alighted at the jetty, paid her visits. But in the evening she revived with a trace of real life, dressed, put on her jewels and recovered her exuberance, her little exclamations and simpers. Then came the dances, the parties, the theatre. Then she was no more than 50. But these were her good days. Sometimes, after a night of insufferable pain, she remained in her bedroom, with yesterday's enamelling untouched, her bald head wrapped in black lace, a black satin bed jacket hanging loosely around her like a sack. And she moaned and cried and shrieked and seemed to be begging for release from her torments. This lasted a couple of days and occurred regularly every 3 weeks, after which she gradually revived again. Her fussy conversation was limited to a constantly recurring discussion of all sorts of family matters, with appropriate annotations. She explained to Cornélie all the family connections of her friends, American and European, but she enlarged more particularly upon the great European families which she numbered among her acquaintances. Cornélie could never listen to what she was saying and forgot the pedigrees again at once. It was sometimes unendurably tedious to have to listen for so long, and only for this reason, as though she was forced to it, Cornélie found the energy to talk a little herself, to relate an anecdote, to tell a story. When she saw that the old woman was very fond of anecdotes, riddles and puns, she collected as many as she could from the Vie Parisienne and the Journal pour Rire, and kept them ready to hand. And Mrs. Uxeley thought her very entertaining. Once, as she noticed Duco's daily letter, she referred to it. And Cornélie suddenly discovered that the old lady was devoured with curiosity. Then she quietly told her the truth: her marriage, her divorce, her independent ideas, her meeting and her life with Duco. The old woman was a little disappointed because Cornélie spoke so simply about it all. She merely advised her to live discreetly and correctly now. What people said about former incidents did not matter so very much, but there must be no occasion for gossip now. Cornélie promised meekly, and Mrs. Uxeley showed her her albums, with her own photographs dating back to her young days, and the photographs of all sorts of men. And she told her about this friend and that friend, and vaingloriously allowed the suggestion of a very lurid past to peep through. But she had always lived discreetly and correctly. That was her pride. And what Cornélie had done was wrong. The hour or so from 11 to 12:30 was a relief. Then the old woman regularly went to sleep, her only sleep in the 24 hours. And Urania came to fetch Cornélie for a drive or a walk along the promenade, or to sit in the Jardin Public. And it was the only moment when Cornélie more or less appreciated her new found luxury and took pleasure in the gratification of her vanity. The passers by turned round to stare at the two young and pretty women in their exquisite serge frocks, with their fashionable headgear, withdrawn in the twilight of their sunshades, and admired the Princess di Forte Braccio's glossy Victoria, irreproachable liveries and the spanking greys. Gilio maintained a reserved and respectful attitude towards Cornélie. He was polite but kept a courteous distance when he joined the two ladies for a moment in the gardens or on the Jetée. After the night in the pergola, after the sudden flash of his angry knife, she was afraid of him. Afraid also because she had lost much of her courage and haughtiness. But she could not answer him more coldly than she did, because she was grateful to him as well as to Urania for the care shown her during the first few days, for their tact in not at once surrendering her to Mrs. Uxeley, and in keeping her with them until she had recovered some of her strength. In the freedom of those mornings when she felt herself released from the old woman, vain, selfish, insignificant, ridiculous, who was at the caricature of her life, she felt that in Urania's friendship she was finding herself again. She became conscious of being at Nice. She contemplated the garish bustle around her with clearer eyes, and she lost the unreality of the first days. At such times it was as though she saw herself again for the first time, in her light serge walking dress, sitting in the garden, her gloved fingers playing with the tassels of her sunshade. She could hardly believe in herself, but she saw herself. Deep down within herself, hidden even from Urania, she concealed her longing, her homesickness, her stifling discontent. She sometimes felt ready to burst into sobs, but she listened to Urania and joined in her laughter, and talked and looked up with a smile at Gilio, who stood in front of her, mincing to and fro on the tips of his shoes and swinging his walking stick behind his back. Sometimes, suddenly, as a vision whirling through the crowd. She saw Duco, the studio, the happiness of the past fading away for one brief moment. Then with her fingertips she felt his letter of that morning, between the strips of the gathered lace in front of her bolero, and just crushed the hard envelope against her breast, as something belonging to him that was caressing her. And it was not to be denied. She saw herself and Nice around her. She became sensible of a new life. It was not unreal, even though it was not actual to her soul. It was a sorrowful comedy in which she, dismally, feebly, listlessly, played her part. End of chapter 44. Chapter 45 of The Inevitable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Hawryluk. The Inevitable by COUPERUS. Translated by Alexander Teixeira de Mattos. The Inevitable, Chapter 45. It was all severely regulated, as by rule, and there was no possibility of the least alteration. Everything was done in accordance with a fixed law: the reading of the newspaper, her hour and a half to herself, then lunch. After lunch, the drive, the jetée, the visits, every day those visits and afternoon teas. Once in a way, a dinner party, and in the evening generally a dance, a reception or a theatre. She made new acquaintances by the score and forgot them again at once and no longer remembered, when she saw them again, whether she knew them or not. As a rule people were fairly pleasant to her in that cosmopolitan set, because they knew that she was an intimate friend of the Princess Urania's. But like Urania herself, she was sometimes conscious, from the feminine bearers of the old Italian names and titles which sometimes glittered in that set, of an overwhelming pride and contempt. The men always asked to be introduced to her, but, whenever she asked to be introduced to their ladies, her only reward was a nod of vague surprise. She herself minded very little, but she felt sorry for Urania, for she saw at once, at Urania's own parties, that they hardly looked upon her as the hostess, that they surrounded and made much of Gilio, but accorded to his wife no more than the civility which was her due as Princess di Forte Braccio, without ever forgetting that she was once Miss Hope. And for Urania this contempt was more difficult to put up with than for herself, for she accepted her rôle as the companion. She always kept an eye on Mrs. Uxeley, constantly joined her for a minute in the course of the evening, fetched a fan which Mrs. Uxeley had left in the next room, or did her this or that trifling service. Then she would sit down against the wall alone in the busily humming drawing room, and gaze indifferently before her. She sat, always very smartly dressed, in an attitude of graceful indifference and weary boredom, tapping her little foot or unfolding her fan. She took no notice of anybody. Sometimes a couple of men would come up to her and she spoke to them, or danced with one of them indifferently as though conferring a favour. Once, when Gilio was talking to her, she sitting and he standing, and the Duchess di Luca and Countess Costi both came up to him and, standing, began to chaff him profusely, without honouring her with a word or a glance. She first stared at the ladies, between her mocking lids, eyeing them from head to foot, and then rose slowly, took Gilio's arm, and, with a glance which darted sharp as a needle from her narrowed eyes, said: I beg your pardon, but you must excuse me if I rob you of the Prince di Fortebraccio, because I have to finish a private conversation." And with the pressure of her arm she made Gilio move on a few steps, then at once sat down again, made him sit down beside her and began to whisper with him very confidentially, while she left the duchess and the countess standing 2 yards away, open-mouthed with stupefaction at her rudeness, and furthermore spread her train wide between herself and the two ladies and waved her fan to and fro, as though to preserve a distance. She could do this sort of thing so calmly, so tactfully and haughtily, that Gilio was tickled to death and sat and giggled with delight. "I wish that Urania knew how to behave like that," he said, pleased as a child at the diversion which she had afforded him. "Urania is too nice to do anything so odious," she replied. She did not make herself liked, but people became afraid of her, afraid of her quiet malice, and avoided offending her in future. Moreover, the men thought her pretty and agreeable, and were also attracted by her haughty indifference. And, without really intending it, she achieved a position, apparently by using the greatest diplomacy, but in reality quite naturally and easily, while Mrs. Uxeley's egotism was flattered by her little attentions, always dutifully remembered and paid with a charming air of maternal solicitude, in contrast to which Mrs. Uxeley thought it delightful to simper like a young girl. Cornélie gradually gathered a court of men around her in the evenings, and the women became insipidly civil. Urania often told her how clever she thought her, how much tact she displayed. Cornélie shrugged her shoulders. It all happened of itself, and really she did not care. But still, gradually she recovered some of her cheerfulness. When she saw herself standing in the glass, she had to confess to herself that she was better looking than she had ever been, either as a girl or as a newly married woman. Her tall, slender figure had a languorous line of pride that gave her a special grace. Her throat was statelier, her bosom fuller, her waist was slimmer in these new dresses, her hips had become heavier, her arms more rounded. And, though her features no longer wore the look of radiant happiness which they had worn in Rome, her mocking smile and her negligent irony gave her a certain attraction for those unknown men, something more alluring and provoking than the greatest coquetry would have been. And Cornélie had not wished for this, but, now that it came of itself, she accepted it. It was foreign to her nature to refuse it, and, besides, Mrs. Uxeley was pleased with her. Cornélie had such a pretty way of whispering to her, "Dear lady, you were in such pain yesterday. Don't you think you ought to go home a little earlier to night?" And then Mrs. Uxeley would simper like a girl who was being admonished by her mother not to dance too much that evening. She loved these little ways of Cornélie's, and Cornélie, with careless indifference, gave her what she wanted. And those evenings amused her more than they did at first, only, the amusement was combined with self-reproach as soon as she thought of Duco, of their separation, of Rome, of the studio, of the happiness of those past days, which she had lost through her lack of fortitude. End of chapter 45. Chapter 46 of The Inevitable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Hawryluk. The Inevitable by Louis COUPERUS. Translated by Alexander Teixeira de Mattos. The Inevitable, Chapter 46. 2 months had passed like this. It was January, and these were busy days for Cornélie, because Mrs. Uxeley was soon to give one of her celebrated evenings, and Cornélie's free hours in the morning were now taken up with running all sorts of errands. Urania generally drove with her, and she came to rely upon Urania. They had to go to upholsterers, to pastry cooks, to florists, and to jewellers, where Cornélie and Urania selected presents for the cotillion. Mrs. Uxeley never went out for this, but occupied herself with every trifling indoor detail, and there were endless discussions, followed by more drives to the shops, for the old lady was anything but easy to please, vain as she was of her fame as a hostess, and afraid of losing it through the least omission. During one of these drives, as the Victoria was turning into the Avenue de la Gare, Cornélie started so violently that she clutched Urania's arm and could not restrain an exclamation. Urania asked her what she had seen, but she was unable to speak, and Urania made her get out at the confectioner's to drink a glass of water. She was very nearly fainting and looked deadly pale. She was not able to continue her errands, and they drove back to Mrs. Uxeley's villa. The old lady was displeased at this sudden fainting fit, and grumbled so that Urania went off alone to complete the errands. After lunch, however, Cornélie felt better, made her apologies, and accompanied Mrs. Uxeley to an afternoon tea. Next day, when she was sitting with Mrs. Uxeley and a couple of friends on the jetée, she seemed to see the same thing again. She turned as white as a sheet, but retained her composure and laughed and talked merrily. These were the days of the preparation. The date of the entertainment drew nearer, and at last the evening arrived. Mrs. Uxeley was trembling with nervousness like a young girl, and found the necessary strength to walk through the whole villa, which was all light and flowers. And with a sigh of satisfaction she sat down for a moment. She was dressed. Her face was smooth as porcelain. Her hair was waved and glittered with diamond pins. Her gown of pale blue brocade was cut very low, and she gleamed like a reliquary. A triple rope of priceless pearls hung down to her waist. In her hand, she was not yet gloved, she held a gold knobbed cane, which was indispensable when she wanted to rise. And it was only when she rose that she showed her age, when she worked herself erect by muscular efforts, with that look of pain in her face, with that twinge of rheumatism which shot through her. Cornélie, not yet dressed, after a last glance through the villa, blazing with light, swooning with flowers, hurried to her room, and, already feeling tired, dropped into the chair in front of her dressing table, to have her hair done quickly. She was irritable, and told the maid to hurry. She was just ready when the first guest arrived, and she was able to join Mrs. Uxeley, and the carriages rolled up. Cornélie, at the top of the monumental staircase, looked down into the hall, where the people were streaming in, the ladies in their long evening wraps, almost more expensive even than their dresses, which they carefully gave up in the crowded buzzing cloakroom. And the first arrivals came up the stairs, waiting so as not to be the very first, and were beamed upon by Mrs. Uxeley. The drawing rooms soon filled. In addition to the reception rooms, the hostess's own rooms were thrown open, forming in all a suite of 12 apartments, whereas the corridors and the stairs were adorned only with clumps of red and white and pink camellias, In the rooms the floral decorations were contained in hundreds of vases and bowls and dishes, which stood about on every hand and, with the light of the shaded candles, gave an intimate charm to the entertainment. That was the specialty of Mrs. Uxeley's decorations on great occasions, the electric lights not used. Instead, on every hand candles with little shades, on every hand glasses and bowls full of flowers, giving the effect of a fairy garden. Though perhaps the main outlines were broken, a most charming effect of coziness was gained. Small groups and couples could find a place everywhere. Behind a screen, in a loggia, you constantly found a spot for privacy, and this perhaps explained the vogue of Mrs. Uxeley's parties. The villa, suitable for giving a court ball, was used only for giving entertainments of a luxurious intimate character to hundreds of people who were quite unknown to one another. Each little set chose itself a little corner where it made itself at home. A very tiny boudoir, all in Japanese lacquer and Japanese silk, was aimed at generally, but was at once captured by Giglio, the Countess di Rosavilla, the Duchess di Luca, and the Countess Costi. They did not even go to the music room, where the concert formed the first item. Paderewski was playing. Sigrid Arnoldson was to sing. The music room also was lighted by shaded candles, and everybody whispered that, in this soft light, Mrs. Uxeley did not look a day over 40. During the interval she simpered to two very young journalists who were to describe her party. Urania, sitting beside Cornélie, was addressed by a Frenchman whom she introduced to her friend, the Chevalier de Breuil. Cornélie knew that Urania had met him at Ostend, and that his name was coupled with the Princess di Fortebraccio's. Urania had never mentioned de Breuil to her, but Cornélie now saw, by her smile, her blush, and the sparkle in her eyes, that people were right. She left them to themselves, feeling sad when she thought of Urania. She understood that the little princess was consoling herself for her husband's neglect, and she suddenly thought this whole life of make-believe disgusting. She longed for Rome, for the studio, for Duco, for independence, love and happiness. She had had it all, but it had been fated not to endure. Everything around her was like one great lie, more brilliant than at the Hague, but even more false, brutal and depraved. People no longer even pretended to believe the lie. Here they showed a brutal sincerity. The lie was respected, but nobody believed in it, nobody put forward the lie as a truth. The lie was nothing more than a form. Cornélie wandered through the rooms by herself, went up to Mrs. Uxeley for a moment, in accordance with her habit, whispered to ask how she felt, whether she wanted anything, if everything was going well, then continued on her way through the rooms. She was standing by a vase, rearranging some orchids, when a woman in black velvet, fair-haired, with a full throat and bosom, spoke to her in English. "I am Mrs. Holt. I dare say you don't know my name, but I know yours. I very much want to make your acquaintance. I have often been to Holland and I read Dutch a little. I read your pamphlet on the social position of divorced women, and I thought a good deal of what you wrote most interesting." "You are very kind. Shall we sit down? I remember your name too. You were one of the leaders of the Women's Congress in London, were you not?" "Yes, I spoke about the training of children. Weren't you able to come to London?" "No, I did think about it, but I was in Rome at the time and I couldn't manage it." "That was a pity. The Congress was a great step forward. If your pamphlet had been translated then and distributed, you would have had a great success." I care very little for success of that kind." "Of course, I can understand that. But the success of your book is also for the good of the great cause." "Do you really mean that? Is there any merit in my little book?" "Do you doubt it?" "Very often." "How is that possible? It is written with such a sure touch." "Perhaps just for that reason." "I don't understand you. There's a vagueness sometimes about Dutch people which we English don't understand, something like a reflection of your beautiful skies in your character." "Do you never doubt? Do you feel sure of your ideas on the training of children?" "I have studied children in schools, in crèches, and in their homes, and I have acquired very decided ideas. And I work in accordance with these ideas for the people of the future. I will send you my pamphlet, containing the gist of my speeches at the Congress." "Are you working on another pamphlet now?" "No, I regret to say." "Why not?" "We must all fight shoulder to shoulder, if we are to conquer." "I believe I have said all that I had to say. I wrote what I did on impulse, from personal experience, and then—" "Yes?" "Then things changed. All women are different, and I never approve of generalizing." "And do you believe that there are many women who can work for a universal object with a man's thoroughness, when they have found a lesser object for themselves, a small happiness, such as a love to satisfy their own ego, in which they can be happy? Don't you think that every woman has slumbering inside her a selfish craving for her own love and happiness, and that, when she has found this, the outside world and the future cease to interest her?" "Possibly, but so few women find it." "I believe there are not many, but that is another question. And I do believe that an interest in universal questions is a pis-aller with most women." "You have become an apostate. You speak quite differently from what you wrote a year ago." "Yes, I have become very humble, because I am more sincere. Of course I believe in certain women, in certain choice spirits. But would the majority not always remain feminine, just women and weak, not with a sensible training? Yes, I believe that it lies in that, in the training of the child, of the girl. I believe that I have never been educated, and that this constitutes my weakness. Our girls should be told when still very young of the struggle that lies before them." "You are right. We, my friends, my sisters and I, had the safety of marriage impressed upon us at the earliest possible moment. Do you know whom I think the most to be pitied? Our parents. They honestly believed that they were having us taught all that was necessary. And now, at this moment, they must see that they did not divine the future correctly, and that their training, their education was no education at all, because they failed to inform their children of the struggle which was being waged right before their eyes. It is our parents that are to be pitied. They can mend nothing now. They see us, girls, young women of 20 to 30, overwhelmed by life, and they have not given us the strength for it. They kept us sheltered as long as possible under the paternal wing. And then they began to think of our marriage, not in order to get rid of us, but with a view to our happiness, our safety and our future. We are indeed unfortunate, we girls and women who were not, like our younger sisters, told of the struggle that lay just before us. But I believe that we may still have hope in our youth, and that our parents are unhappier and more to be pitied than we, because they have nothing more to hope for, and because they must secretly confess that they went astray in their love for their children. They were still educating us according to the past, while the future was already so near at hand. I pity our parents, and I could almost love them better for that reason than I ever did before." End of chapter 46. Chapter 47 of The Inevitable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Hawryluk. The Inevitable by COUPERUS. Translated by Alexander TEIXEIRA de MATTOS. The Inevitable, Chapter 47. She had suddenly turned very pale, as though under the stress of a sudden emotion. She covered her face with her fluttering fan, and her fingers trembled violently. Her whole body shuddered. "That is well thought on your part," said Mrs. Holt. "I am glad to have met you. I've always found a certain charm in Dutch people, that vagueness which we are unable to seize, and then all at once a light that flashes out of a cloud. I hope to see you again. I'm at home on Tuesdays at 5 o'clock. Will you come one day with Mrs. Uxeley?" Mrs. Holt pressed her hand and disappeared among the other guests. Cornélie had risen from her chair, while her knees seemed to give way beneath her. She remained standing, half turned towards the room, looking in the glass, and her fingers played with the orchids in the Venetian vase on the console table. She was still rather pale, but controlled herself, though her heart was beating loudly and her breast heaving, and she looked into the glass. She saw first her own figure, her beautiful, slender outline, in her dress of white and black Chantilly, with the white lace train foaming with flounces, the black lace tunic with the scallop border and a sprinkle with steel spangles and blue stones, a spray of orchids in the sleeveless corsage, which left her neck and arms and shoulders bare. Her hair was bound with 3 Greek fillets of pearls, and her fan of white feathers, a present from Urania, was like foam against her throat. She saw herself first, and then, in the mirror, she saw him. He was coming nearer to her. She did not move, only her fingers played with the flowers in the vase. She felt as though she wished to take flight, but her knees gave way and her feet were paralyzed. She stood rooted to the floor, hypnotized. She was unable to stir, and she saw him come nearer and nearer, while her back remained half turned to the room. He approached, and his appearance seemed to fling out a net in which she was caught. He was close by her now, close behind her. Mechanically she raised her eyes and looked in the glass and met his eyes in the mirror. She thought that she would faint. She felt squeezed between him and the glass. In the mirror the room went round and round. The candles whirled giddily, like a reeling firmament. He did not say anything yet. She only saw his eyes gazing and his mouth smiling under his moustache. And he still said nothing. Then, in that unendurable lack of space between him and the mirror, which did not even give shelter as a wall would have done, but which reflected him so that he held her twice imprisoned, behind and before, she turned round slowly and looked him in the eyes. But she did not speak either. They looked at each other without a word. "You never expected this, that you would see me here one day," he said at last. It was more than a year since she had heard his voice, but she felt his voice inside her. "No," she answered at last, haughtily, coldly, distantly, "though I saw you once or twice in the street on the Jetée." "Yes," he said. "Should I have bowed to you, do you think?" She shrugged her bare shoulders, and he looked at them. She felt for the first time that she was half naked that evening. "No," she replied, still coldly and distantly, "any more than you need have spoken to me now." He smiled at her. He stood before her as a wall. He stood before her as a man. His head, his shoulders, his chest, his legs, his whole stature rose before her as incarnate manhood. "Of course I needn't have done so," he said, and she felt his voice inside her. She felt his voice sinking in her like molten bronze into a mould. "If I had met you somewhere in Holland, I would only have taken off my hat and not spoken to you. But we are in a foreign country." "What difference does that make?" "I felt I should like to speak to you. I wanted to have a talk with you. Can't we do that as strangers?" "As strangers?" she echoed. "Oh, well, we're not strangers. We even know each other uncommonly intimately, eh? Come and sit down and tell me about yourself. Did you like Rome?" "Yes," she said. He had led her as though with his will to a couch behind a half damask, half glass, Louis XV screen, and she dropped down upon it in a rosy twilight of candles, with a bunch of pink roses around her in all sorts of Venetian glasses. He sat on an ottoman, bending towards her slightly, with his arms on his knees and his hands folded together. "They've been gossiping about you finely at the Hague. First about your pamphlet and then about your painter." Her eyes pierced him like needles. He laughed. "You can look just as angry as ever. Tell me, do you ever hear from the old people?" "They're in a bad way." "Now and then I was able to send them some money lately." "That's damn good of you." "They don't deserve it. They said that you no longer existed for them. Mamma wrote that they were so pushed for money. Then I sent them 100 guilders. It was the most that I could do." "Oh, now that they find you sending them money, you'll begin to exist for them again." She shrugged her shoulders. "I don't mind that. I was sorry for them. And sorry I couldn't send them more. Ah, when you look so thundering smart." "I don't pay for my clothes." "I'm only stating a fact. I'm not venturing to criticize. I think it damn handsome of you to send them money. But you do look thundering smart. Look here, let me tell you something. You've become a damn handsome girl." He stared at her, with his smile, which compelled her to look at him. Then she replied, very calmly, waving her fan lightly in front of her bare neck, sheltering in the foam of her fan. "I'm damn glad to hear it." He gave a loud, throaty laugh. "There, I like that. You've still got your witty sense of repartee. Always to the point. Damn clever of you." She stood up, strained and nervous. "I must leave you. I must go to Mrs. Uxeley." He spread out his arms. "Stay and sit with me a little longer. It does me good to talk to you. Then restrain yourself a bit and don't damn quite so much. I've not been used to it lately." "I'll do my best. Sit down." She fell back and hid herself behind her fan. "Let me tell you that you have positively become a very beautiful woman. Now is that like a compliment?" "It sounds more like one." "Well, it's the best I can do, you know. So you must make the most of it. And now tell me about Rome. How are you living there?" "Why should I tell you about it?" "Because I'm interested." "You have no need to be interested." "I dare say, but I happen to be. I've never quite forgotten you, and I should be surprised if you had me." "I have, quite," she said coolly. He looked at her with his smile. He said nothing, but she felt that he knew better. She was afraid to convince him further. "Is it true what they say at the Hague? About Van der Staal?" She looked at him haughtily. "Come, out with it." "Yes." "You are a cheeky baggage. Do you no longer care a straw for the whole boiling of them?" "No." "And how do you manage here, with this old hag?" "What do you mean? Do they just accept you here, at Nice?" "I don't brag about my independence, and no one is able to comment on my conduct here." Where is Van der Staal? At Florence. Why isn't he here? I'm not going to answer any more questions. You are indiscreet. It has nothing to do with you and I won't be cross-examined." She was very nervous again and once more rose to her feet. He spread out his arms. "Really, Rudolph, you must let me go," she entreated. "I have to go to Mrs. Uxeley. They are to dance a pavane in the ballroom and I have to ask for instructions and hand them on. Let me pass. Then I'll take you there. Let me offer you my arm." "Rudolph, do go away. Don't you see how you're upsetting me? This meeting has been so unexpected. Do let me go, or I shan't be able to control myself. I'm going to cry." "Why did you speak to me? Why did you speak to me? Why did you come here, where you knew that you would meet me?" "Because I wanted to see one of Mrs. Uxeley's parties, and because I wanted to meet you. You must understand that it upsets me to see you again." "What good does it do you? We are dead to each other. Why should you want to pester me like this? That's just what I wanted to know, whether we are dead to each other." "Dead, dead, quite dead," she cried vehemently. He laughed. "Come, don't be so theatrical. You can understand that I was curious to see you again and talk to you. I used to see you in the street, in your carriage, on the Jetée, and I was pleased to find you looking so well, so smart, so happy and so handsome. You know that good-looking women are my great hobby. You are much better looking than you used to be when you were my wife. If you had been then what you are now, I should never have allowed you to divorce me. Come, don't be a child. No one knows here. I think it damned jolly to meet you here, to have a good old yarn with you and to have you leaning on my arm. Take my arm. Don't make a fuss and I'll take you where you want to go. Where shall we find Mrs. Uxeley? Introduce me, as a friend from Holland." "Rudolph." "Oh, I insist. Don't bother. There's nothing in it. It amuses me and it's no end of a lark to walk about with one's divorced wife at a ball at Nice. A delightful town, isn't it? I go to Monte Carlo every day and I've been damn lucky. Won 3,000 francs yesterday. Will you come with me one day?" "You're mad." "I'm not mad at all. I want to enjoy myself and I'm proud to have you on my arm." She withdrew her arm. "Well, you needn't be. Now, don't get spiteful. That's all rot. Let's enjoy ourselves. There's the old girl. She's looking at you." She had passed through some of the rooms on his arm, and they saw, near a tombola, round which people were crowding to draw presents and surprises, Mrs. Uxeley, Gilio and the Rosavilla, Costa and the Lucca ladies. They were all very gay round the pyramid of knickknacks, behaving like children when the number of one of them turned up on the roulette wheel. "Mrs. Uxeley," Cornélie began in a trembling voice, "may I introduce a fellow countryman of mine, Baron Brox." Mrs. Uxeley simpered, uttered a few amiable words and asked if he wouldn't draw a number. The roulette wheel spun round and round. "A fellow countryman, Cornélie?" "Yes, Mrs. Uxeley." "What did you say his name is?" "Baron Brox." "A splendid fellow, a handsome fellow, an astonishingly handsome fellow." "What is he? What does he do?" "He's in the army, a first lieutenant." "In which regiment?" "In the Hussars." "At the Hague?" "Yes. An amazingly good-looking fellow. I like those tall, fine men." "Mrs. Uxeley, is everything going as it should?" "Yes, darling. Do you feel all right?" "I have a little pain, but nothing to speak about." "Won't it soon be time for the pavane?" "Yes. See that the girls go and get dressed. Has the hairdresser brought the wigs for the young men?" "Yes." "Then go and collect them and tell them to hurry up. They must be ready within half an hour." Rudolph Brox returned from the tombola, where he had drawn a silver matchbox. He thanked Mrs. Uxley, who simpered, and when he saw that Cornélie was moving away, he went after her. "Cornélie, please, Rudolph, let me be. I have to collect the girls and the men for the pavane. I have a lot to do. I'll help you." She beckoned to a girl or two and sent a couple of footmen to hunt through the room for the young men and to ask them to go to the dressing room. He saw that she was pale and trembling all over her body. "What's the matter?" "I'm tired." "Then let's go and get something to drink." She was numb with nervousness. The music of the invisible band boomed fiercely against her brain, and at times the innumerable candles whirled before her eyes like a reeling firmament. The rooms were choked with people. They crowded and laughed aloud and showed one another their presence. The men trod on the ladies' trains. An intoxicating, suffocating fragrance of flowers, the atmosphere peculiar to crowded functions, and the warm, perfumed odour of women's flesh hung in the rooms like a cloud. Cornélie hunted hither and thither and at last collected all the girls. The ballet master came to ask her something. A butler came to ask her something, and Brox did not budge from her side. "Let's go now and get something to drink," he said. She mechanically took his arm, and her hand trembled on the sleeves of his dress coat. He pushed his way with her through the crowd. They passed Urania and de Breuil. Urania said something which Cornélie did not catch. The refreshment room also was chock full and buzzed with loud laughing voices. Behind the long table stood the butler, like a minister, supervising the whole service. There was no crowding, no fighting for a glass of wine or a sandwich. People waited until a footman brought it on a tray. "It's very well managed," said Brox. "Do you do all this?" "No, it's been done like this for years." She dropped into a chair, looking very pale. "What will you have?" "A glass of champagne." "I'm hungry. I had a bad dinner at my hotel. I must have something to eat." He ordered the champagne for her. He ate first a patty, then another, then a chateaubriand and peas. He drank 2 glasses of claret, followed by a glass of champagne. The footman brought him everything, dish by dish, on a silver tray. His handsome, virile face was brick red in colour with health and animal strength. The stiff hair on his round, heavy skull was cropped quite close. His large grey eyes were bright and laughing, with a straight, impudent glance. A heavy, well-tended moustache curled over his mouth, in which the white teeth gleamed. He stood with his legs slightly astraddle, firm and soldierly in his dress coat, which he wore with an easy correctness. He ate slowly and with relish, enjoying his good glass of fine wine. Mechanically she now watched him from her chair. She had drunk a glass of champagne and asked for another, and the stimulant revived her. Her cheeks recovered some of their colour, her eyes sparkled. "They do damn well here," he said, coming up to her with his glass in his hand. And he emptied his glass. "They are going to dance the pavane almost at once," she murmured. And they passed through the crowded rooms to a big corridor outside, which looked like an avenue of camellia shrubs. They were alone for a moment. "This is where the dancers are to meet." "Then let's wait for them. It's nice and cool out here." They sat down on a bench. "Are you feeling better?" he asked. "You were so queer in the ballroom." "Yes, I'm better." "Don't you think it's fun to meet your old husband again?" "Rudolph, I don't understand how you can talk to me like that and persecute me and tease me, after everything that has happened." "Oh, well, all that has happened and is done with. Do you think it's discreet on your part, or delicate?" "No, neither discreet nor delicate. Those, you know, are things I've never been. You used to fling that in my face often enough in the old days. But if it's not delicate, it's amusing. Have you lost your sense of humour? It's damned jolly humorous, our meeting here. And now listen to me. You and I are divorced. All right, that's so in the eyes of the law. But a legal divorce is a matter of law and form, for the benefit of society. As regards money affairs and so on. We've been too much husband and wife not to feel something for each other at a later meeting, such as this. Yes, I know what you want to say. It's simply untrue. You've been too much in love with me and I with you for everything between us to be dead. I remember everything still, and you must do the same. Do you remember when? He laughed, pushed near to her and whispered close in her ear. She felt his breath thrilling on her flesh like a warm breeze. She flushed crimson with nervous distress. And she felt with her whole body that he had been her husband and that he had entered into her very blood. His voice ran like molten bronze along her nerves of hearing, deep down within her. She knew him through and through. She knew his eyes, his mouth. She knew his broad, well-kept hands with the large round nails and the dark signet ring, as they lay on his knees, which showed square and powerful under the crease in his dress trousers. And she felt, like a sudden despair, that she knew and felt him in her whole body, however rough he might have been to her in the old days, however much he had ill-treated her, striking her with his clenched fists, banging her against the wall. She had been his wife. She, a virgin, had become his wife, had been initiated into womanhood by him. And she felt that he had branded her as his own. She felt it in her blood and in the marrow of her bones. She confessed to herself that she had never forgotten him. During the first lonely days in Rome she had longed for his kisses, she had thought of him, had conjured up his virile image before her mind, had persuaded herself to believe that, by exercising tact and patience and a little management, she could have remained his wife. Then the great happiness had come, the gentle happiness of perfect harmony. It all flashed through her like lightning. Oh, in that great, gentle happiness she had been able to forget everything. She had not felt the past within her. But she now felt that the past always remained, irrevocably and indelibly. She had been his wife and she had held him still in her blood. She felt it now with every breath that she drew. She was indignant because he dared to whisper about the old days in her ear. But it had all been as he said, irrevocably, indelibly. "Rudolph," she entreated, clasping her hands together, "spare me." She almost screamed it in a cry of fear and despair. But he laughed and with one hand seized both hers, clasped in entreaty. "If you go on like that, if you look at me so beseechingly with those beautiful eyes, I won't spare you even here, and I'll kiss you until—" His words swept over her like a scorching wind, but laughing voices approached and two girls and two young men, dressed up for the pavane as Henry IV and Margaret de Valois, came running down the stairs. "What's become of the others?" they cried, looking round in the staircase. And they came dancing up to Cornélie. The ballet master also approached. She did not understand what he said. "Where are the others?" she repeated, mechanically, in a hoarse voice. "Here they come. Now we're all here." They were all talking and laughing and glittering and buzzing about her. She summoned up all her poor strength and issued a few instructions. The guests streamed into the great ballroom, sat down in the front chairs, crowded together in the corners. The pavane was danced in the middle of the room, to an old trailing melody. A long winding curve of graceful steps, deep bows and satin glimmering with sudden lustre like that of porcelain, with the occasional flutter of a cape, and a flash of light on the rapier. End of chapter 47. Chapter 48 of The Inevitable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Hawryluk. The Inevitable by COUPERUS. Translated by Alexander Teixeira de Mattos. The Inevitable, Chapter 48. Urania, I beseech you, help me. What is it? Come with me. She had seized Urania by the hand and dragged her away from De Breuil into one of the deserted rooms. The suite of rooms was almost entirely deserted. The dense throng of guests stood packed along the sides of the great ballroom to watch the pavane. What is it, Cornélie? Cornélie was trembling in every limb and clutching Urania's arm. She drew her to the farthest corner of the room. There was no one there. Urania, she entreated, in a supreme crisis of nervousness. Help me. What am I to do? I have met him unexpectedly. Don't you know whom I mean? My husband, my divorced husband. I have seen him once or twice before, in the street and on the jetée. The time when I was so startled, you know, when I almost fainted, that was because of him. And he has been talking to me now, here, a moment ago, and I'm afraid of him. He spoke quite nicely, said he wanted to talk to me. It was so strange. Everything was finished between us. We were divorced. And suddenly I met him and he speaks to me and asks me what sort of time I've had. Tells me that I am looking well, that I have grown beautiful. Tell me, Urania, what am I to do? I'm frightened. I'm ill with anxiety. I want to get away. I should like best to go away at once, to Florence, to Duco. I'm so frightened, Urania. I want to go to my room. Tell Mrs. Uxeley that I want to go to my room. She hardly knew what she was saying. The words fell incoherently from her lips, as in a fever. Men's voices approached. They were those of Gilio, De Breuil, the Duc de Luca, and the young journalist, the two who were pushing their way into society. "What is it Signora de Retz doing?" asked the Duke. "We are missing her everywhere." And the young journalist, standing in the shadow of these eminent noblemen, confirmed the statement. They had been missing her everywhere. "Fetch Mrs. Uxeley here," Urania whispered to Gilio. "Cornélie is ill, I think. I can't leave her here alone. She wants to go to her room. It's better that Mrs. Uxeley should know, else she might be angry." Cornélie was jesting nervously, in feverish gaiety, with the Duke and with De Breuil and the journalists. "Would you rather I took you straight to Mrs. Uxeley?" Gilio whispered. "I want to go to my room," she whispered in a voice of entreaty behind her fan. The pavane appeared to be over. The buzz of voices reached them, as though the guests were scattering about the rooms again. "I see Mrs. Uxeley," said Gilio. He went up to her, spoke to her. She simpered at first, leaning on the gold knob of her cane. Then her wrinkles became angrily contracted. She crossed the room. Cornélie went on jesting with the Duke. The journalist thought every word witty. "Aren't you well?" whispered Mrs. Uxeley, going up to her, ruffled. "What about the cotillon?" "I will see to everything, Mrs. Uxeley," said Urania. "Impossible, dear princess, and I shouldn't dream of letting you either." "Introduce me to your friend, Cornélie," said a deep voice behind Cornélie. She felt that voice like bronze inside her body. She turned round automatically. It was he. She seemed unable to escape him, and under his gaze as though hypnotized, she appeared, very strangely, to recover her strength. It seemed as though he were willing her not to be ill. She murmured, "Urania, may I introduce a fellow countryman, Baron Brox, Princess di Forte Braccio." Urania knew his name, knew who he was. "Darling," she whispered to Cornélie, "let me take you to your room. I'll see to everything." "It's no longer necessary," she said. "I'm much better. I only want a glass of champagne. I am much better, Mrs. Uxeley." "Why did you run away from me?" asked Rudolph Brox, with his smile and his eyes in Cornélie's eyes. She smiled and said the first thing that came into her head. "The dancing has begun," said Mrs. Uxeley, "but who's going to lead my cotillion presently?" "If I can be of any service, Mrs. Uxeley," said Brox. "I have some little talent as a cotillion leader." Mrs. Uxeley was delighted. It was arranged that De Breuil and Urania, Gilio and the Countess Costi and Brox and Cornélie should lead the figures in turns. "You poor darling," Urania said in Cornélie's ear. "Can you manage it?" Cornélie smiled. "Yes, yes, I'm all right again," she whispered. And she moved towards the ballroom on Brox's arm. Urania stared after her in amazement. End of chapter 48. Chapter 49 of The Inevitable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Hawryluk. The Inevitable by Louis COUPERUS. Translated by Alexander Teixeira de Mattos. The Inevitable, Chapter 49. It was 12 o'clock when Cornélie woke that morning. The sun was piercing the golden slit in the half-parted curtains with tiny eddying atoms. She felt dog-tired. She remembered that Mrs. Uxeley, on the morning after one of these parties, left her free to rest. The old lady herself stayed in bed, although she did not sleep. And Cornélie lacked the smallest capacity to rise. She remained lying where she was, heavy with fatigue. Her eyes wandered through the untidy room. Her handsome ball dress, hanging listlessly, limply over a chair, at once reminded her of yesterday. For that matter, everything in her was thinking of yesterday. Everything in her was thinking of her husband, with a tense, hypnotized consciousness. She felt as if she were recovering from a nightmare, a bout of drunkenness, a swoon. It was only by drinking glass after glass of champagne that she had been able to keep going, had been able to dance with Brox, had been able to lead the figure when their turn came. But it was not only the champagne. His eyes also held her up, had prevented her from fainting, from bursting into sobs, from screaming and waving her arms like a mad woman. When he had taken his leave, when everybody had gone, she had collapsed in a heap and been taken to bed. The moment she was no longer under his eyes, she had felt her misery and her weakness, and the champagne, as it were, suddenly clouded her brain. Now she lay thinking of him in the dejected slackness of her overwhelming morning fatigue, and it seemed to her as if her whole Italian year had been an interlude, a dream. She saw herself at the Hague again, with her pretty little face and her little flirting ways and her phrases always to the point. She saw their first meeting and how she had at once fallen under his influence and been able to flirt with him, because he laughed at her little feminine defences. He had been too strong for her from the first. Then came their engagement. He laid down the law and she rebelled, angrily, with violent scenes, not wishing to be controlled, injured in her pride as a girl who had always been spoiled and made much of. And then he had subdued her as though with the rude strength of his fist, and always with a laugh on his handsome mouth, until they were married, until she created a scandal and ran away. He had refused to be divorced at first, but had consented later, because of the scandal. She had freed herself. She had fled. The feminist movement, Italy, Duco. Was it a dream? Was the great happiness, the delightful harmony, a dream, and was she awakening after a year of dreams? Was she divorced or was she not? She had to make an effort to remember the formalities. Yes, they were legally divorced. But was she divorced? Was everything over between them? And was she really no longer his wife? Why had he done it? Why had he pursued her after seeing her once at Nice? Oh, he had told her, during that cotillion, that endless cotillion. He had become proud of her when he saw how beautiful she was and how smart, how happy she looked driving in Mrs. Uxeley's or the Princess Elegant Victoria. It was then that he had seen her, beautiful, smart and happy, and he had grown jealous. She, a beautiful woman, had been his wife. He felt that he had a right to her, notwithstanding the law. What was the law? Had the law taught her womanhood, or had he? And he had made her feel his right, together with the irrevocable past. It was all irrevocable and indelible. She looked about her, at her wits' end what to do, and she began to weep, to sob. Then she felt something gaining strength within her. The instinctive rebellion that leaped up within her like a spring which had at length recovered its resilience. Now that she was resting and no longer under his eyes, she would not, she refused to feel him in her blood. Should she meet him once more, she would speak to him calmly, very curtly, and order him to leave her, show him the door, have him put out of the door. She clenched her fists with rage. She hated him. She thought of Duco, and she thought of writing to him, telling him everything, and she thought of going back to him as quickly as possible. He was not a dream. He existed, even though he was living so far away, at Florence. She had saved a little money. They would find their happiness again in the studio in Rome. She would write to him, and she wanted to get away as quickly as possible. With Duco she would be safe. Oh, how she longed for him, to lie so softly and quietly and blissfully in his arms, against his breast, as in the embrace of a miraculous happiness. Was it all true, their happiness, their love and harmony? Yes, it had existed. It was not a dream. There were his photographs. There, on the wall, were two of his watercolours, the sea at Sorrento and the skies over Amalfi, done in those days which had been like poems. She would be safer with him. When she was with Duco, she would not feel Rudolph, her husband, in her blood, for she felt Duco in her soul, and her soul would be the stronger. She would feel Duco in her soul, in her heart, in all the most fervent part of her life, and gather from him her uppermost strength, like a sheaf of gleaming sword blades. Already now, when she thought of him with such longing, she felt herself growing stronger. She could have spoken to Brox now. Yesterday he had taken her by surprise, had squeezed her between himself and that looking-glass, till she had seen him double and lost her wits and been defeated. That would never happen again. That was only due to the surprise. If she spoke to him again now, she would triumph, thanks to what she had learned as a woman who stood on her own feet. And she got up and opened the windows and put on her dressing gown. She looked at the blue sea, at the motley traffic on the promenade, and she sat down and wrote to Duco. She told him everything, her first startled meeting, her surprise and defeat at the ball. Her pen flew over the paper. She did not hear the knock at the door, did not hear Urania come in carefully, fearing lest she should still be asleep and anxious to know how she felt. Excitedly she read out part of her letter and said that she was ashamed of her weakness of yesterday. How she could have behaved like that she herself was unable to understand. No, she herself could not understand it. Now that she felt somewhat rested and was speaking to Urania, who reminded her of Rome, and holding her long letter to Duco in her hand, now she herself did not understand it all, and wondered which had been a dream, her Italian year of happiness or that nightmare of yesterday. End of chapter 49. Chapter 50 of The Inevitable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Hawryluk. The Inevitable by COUPERUS. Translated by Alexander Teixeira de Mattos. The Inevitable, Chapter 50. She stayed at home for a day, feeling tired and, deep down within herself, almost unconsciously, afraid, in spite of all, of meeting him. But Mrs. Uxeley, who would never hear of illness or fatigue, was so much put out that Cornélie accompanied her next day to the Promenade des Anglais. Friends came up to talk to them and gathered round their chairs, with Rudolph Brox among them. But Cornélie avoided any confidential conversation. Some days later, however, he called on Mrs. Uxeley's at-home day, and, amid the crowd of visitors paying duty calls after the party, he was able to speak to her for a moment alone. He came up to her with that laugh of his, as though his eyes were laughing, as though his moustache were laughing. And she collected all her thoughts, so that she might be firm with him. "Rudolph," she said loftily, "it is simply ridiculous. If you don't think it indelicate, you might at least try to think it ridiculous. It tickles your sense of humour, but imagine what people would say about it in Holland. The other evening at the party you took me by surprise and somehow, I really don't know how it happened, I yielded to your strange wish to dance with me and to lead the cotillion. I frankly confess, I was confused. I now see everything clearly and plainly, and tell you this. I refuse to meet you again. I refuse to speak to you again. I refuse to turn the solemn earnest of our divorce into a farce." "If you look back," he said, "you will recollect that you never got anything out of me with that lofty tone and those dignified airs, but that, on the contrary, you just stimulate me to do what you don't want. If that is so, I shall simply tell Mrs. Uxeley in what relation I stand to you and ask her to forbid you her house." He laughed. She lost her temper. "Do you intend to behave like a gentleman or like a cad?" He turned red and clenched his fists. "Curse you," he hissed in his moustache. "Perhaps you would like to hit me and knock me about," she continued scornfully. He mastered himself. "We are in a room full of people," she sneered defiantly. "What if we were alone? You've already clenched your fists. You would thrash me as you did before. You brute, you brute. And you are very brave in this room full of people," he laughed, with his laugh which incited her to rage. when it did not subdue her. "No, I shouldn't thrash you," he continued. "I should kiss you." "This is the last time you're going to speak to me," she hissed furiously. Go away, or I don't know what I shall do. I shall make a scene." He sat down calmly. "As you please," he said quietly. She stood trembling before him, impotent. Someone spoke to her. The footman handed her some tea. She was now in the midst of a circle of men, and mastering herself she jested, with loud, nervous gaiety, flirted more coquettishly than ever. There was a little court around her, with the Duc de Luca as its ringleader. Close by, Rudolph Brock sat drinking his tea, with apparent calmness as though waiting. But his strong, masterful blood was boiling madly within him. He could have murdered her, and he was seeing red with jealousy. That woman was his, despite the law. He was not going to be afraid of any more scandal. She was beautiful. She was as he wished her to be, and he wanted her, his wife. He knew how he would win her back, and this time he would not lose her. This time she should be his, for as long as he wished. As soon as he was able to speak to her unheard, he came up to her again. She was just going to Urania, whom she saw sitting with Mrs. Uxeley, when he said in her ear, sternly and abruptly, "Cornélie." She turned round mechanically, but with her haughty glance. She would rather have gone on, but could not. Something held her back, a secret strength, a secret superiority, which sounded in his voice and flowed into her with a weight as of bronze that weakened and paralyzed her energy. "What is it?" she asked. "I want to speak to you alone." "No." "Yes." "Listen to me calmly for a moment, if you can. I am calm too, as you see. You needn't be afraid of me. I promise not to ill-treat you or even swear at you, but I must speak to you alone. After our meeting, after the ball last week, we can't part like this. You are not even entitled to show me the door, after talking to me and dancing with me so recently. There's no reason and no logic in it. You lost your temper, but let us both keep our tempers now. I want to speak to you." "I can't. Mrs. Uxeley doesn't like me to leave the drawing room when there are people here. I am dependent on her." He laughed. "You are almost even more dependent on her than you used to be on me. But you can give me just a second, in the next room." "No." "Yes, you can." "What do you want to speak to me about?" "I can't tell you here. I can't speak to you alone. I'll tell you what it is. You're afraid to." "No." "Yes, you are. You're afraid of me. With all your airs and your dignity, you're afraid to be alone with me for a moment." "I'm not afraid." "You are afraid. You're shaking in your shoes with fear. You received me with a fine speech which you rehearsed in advance. Now that you've delivered your speech, it's over and you're frightened." "I'm not frightened." "Then come with me, my plucky authoress of the social position of the what's her name. I promise, I swear that I shall be calm and tell you calmly what I have to say to you. And I give you my word of honour not to hit you. Which room shall we go to? Do you refuse? Listen to me. If you don't come with me, it's not finished yet. If you do, perhaps it will be finished, and you will never see me again. What can you have to say to me? Come." She yielded because of his voice, not because of his words. "But only for 3 minutes." "Very well, 3 minutes." She took him into the passage and into an empty room. "Well, what is it?" she asked, frightened. "Don't be frightened," he said, laughing under his moustache. "Don't be frightened. I only want to tell you that you are my wife. Do you understand that? Don't try to deny it. I felt it at the ball the other night when I had my arm round you, waltzing with you. Don't try to deny that you pressed yourself against me for a moment. You're my wife. I felt it then and I feel it now, and you feel it too, though you would like to deny it. But that won't help you. What has been can't be altered, and what has been always remains part of you. There, you can't say that I am not speaking prettily and delicately. Not an oath, not an improper word has escaped my lips, for I don't want to make you angry. I only want to make you confess that what I say is true, and that you are still my wife. That law doesn't signify. It's another law that rules us. It's a law that rules you especially, a law which, without our ever suspecting it, brings us together again, even though it does so by a very strange, roundabout path, along which you especially have strayed. That law rules you especially. I am convinced that you still love me, or at least that you are still in love with me. I feel it, I know it as a fact. Don't try to deny it. It's no use, Cornélie. And I'll tell you something besides. I am in love with you too, and more so than ever. I feel it when you're flirting with those fellows. I could wring your neck then. I could break every bone in their bodies. Don't be afraid. I'm not going to. I'm not in a temper. I just want to talk to you calmly and make you see the truth. Do you see it before you? It is incontrovertible. You see, you have nothing to say in reply. Facts are facts. Will you show me the door now? Do you still propose to speak to Mrs. Uxeley? I shouldn't if I were you. Your friend, the princess, knows who I am. Leave it at that. Had the old woman never heard my name, or had she forgotten it? Forgotten it, I expect. Well then, don't trouble to refresh her ancient memory. Leave things as they are. It's better to say nothing. No, the position is not ridiculous, and it's not humorous either. It has become very serious. The truth is always serious. It is strange, I admit. I should never have expected it. It's a revelation to me as well. And now I've said what I had to say. Less than 5 minutes by my watch. They will hardly have noticed your absence in the drawing room, and now I am going. But first give your husband a kiss, for I am your husband, and always shall be. She stood trembling before him. It was his voice, which felt like molten bronze into her soul, into her body, and lamed and paralyzed her. It was his voice of persuasion, of persuasive charm, the voice which she knew of old, the voice that compelled her to do everything that he wanted. Under the influence of that voice she became a thing, a chattel, something that belonged to him, once he had branded her forever as his mate. She was powerless to cast him out herself, to shake him from herself, to erase from herself the stamp of his possession and the brand which marked her as his property. She was his, and anything that otherwise was herself had left her. There was no longer in her brain either memory or thought. She saw him come up to her and put his arm around her. He took her to his breast slowly, but so firmly that he seemed to be taking possession of her entirely. She felt herself melting away in his arms as in a scorching flame. On her lips she felt his mouth, his moustache, pressing, 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 until she closed her eyes, half fainting. He said something more in her ear, with that voice under which she seemed not to count, as though she were nothing, as though she existed only through him. When he released her, she staggered on her feet. "Come, pull yourself together," she heard him say, calmly, authoritatively, omnipotently, "and accept the position. Things are as they are. There is no altering them. Thank you for letting me speak to you. Everything is all right between us now. I'm sure of it. And now, au revoir. Au revoir." He kissed her again. "Give me a kiss too," he said with that voice of his. She flung her arm round his body and kissed him on the lips. "Au revoir," he said once more. She saw him laugh under his moustache, his eyes laughed at her with flames of gold, and he went away. She heard his feet going down the stairs and ringing on the marble of the hall, with the strength of his firm tread. She remained standing as though bereft of life. In the drawing room, next to the room in which she was, the hum of laughing voices sounded loudly. She saw Rome before her, saw Duco, in a short flash of lightning. It was gone, and, collapsing into a chair, she uttered a suppressed cry of despair, put her hands before her face and sobbed, restraining her despair before all those people, dully, as from a stifling throat. End of chapter 50. Chapter 51 of The Inevitable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Hawryluk. The Inevitable by COUPERUS. Translated by Alexander TEIXEIRA de MATTOS. The Inevitable. Chapter 51. She had but one thought, to take to flight. To fly from his mastery, to fly from the emanation of that dominion which, mysteriously but irrevocably, wiped away with his caress all that was in her of will, energy and self. She remembered having felt the same thing in the old days, rebellion and anger when he became angry and coarse, but an eclipse of self when he caressed her, an inability to think when he merely laid his hands upon her head, a swooning away into a vast nothingness when he took her in his arms and kissed her. She had felt it from the first time of seeing him, when he stood before her and looked down upon her with that light irony in the smile of his eyes and his moustache, as though he took pleasure in her resistance. At that time, prompted by flirting and fun, soon by petulance, later by anger and fury, as though he took pleasure in her futile feminine attempts to escape his power. He had at once realized that he ruled this woman, and she had found in him her master, her sole master. For no other man pressed down upon her with that empire which was of the blood, of the flesh. On the contrary, she was usually the superior. She had about her a cool indifference which was always provoking her to destructive criticism. She had a need for fun, for cheerful conversation, for coquetry, for flirtation. And, always a mistress of quick repartee, she invited the occasion for repartee. But, apart from this, men meant little to her, and she always saw the absurd side of each of them, thinking this one too short, that one too tall, a third clumsy, a fourth stupid, finding something in every one of them to rouse her laughter, her mockery or her criticism. She would never be a woman to give herself to many. She had met Duco and given herself to him with her love, wholly, as one great inseparable golden gift, and after him she would never fall in love again. But before Duco she had met Rudolph Brox. Perhaps, if she had met him after Duco, his mastery would not have swayed her. She did not know, and what was the good of thinking about it? The thing was as it was. In her blood she was not a woman for many. In her blood she was the wife, the spouse, the consort. Of the man who had been her husband she was in her flesh and in her blood the wife. And she was his wife even without love. for she could not call this love. She gave the name of love only to that other passion, that proud, tender, and intense completion of life's harmony, that journey along one's golden line, the marriage of two gleaming lines. But the phantom hands had risen all about them in a cloud. The hands had mysteriously and inevitably divided their golden line, and hers, a winding curve, had leaped back, like a quivering spring, crossing a darker line of former days, a sombre line of the past, a dark track full of unconscious action and fatal bondage. Oh, the strangeness, the most mysterious strangeness of those lines of life! Why should they curl back, force her backward to her original starting point? Why had it all been necessary? She had but one thought, to take to flight. She did not see the inevitability of those lines and the fatality of those paths, and she did not wish to feel the pressure of the phantom hands that rose about her. To fly, to turn up the dusky path, back to the point of separation, back to Duco, and with him to rebraid and twist the two lost directions into one pure movement, one line of happiness. To fly, to fly. She told Urania that she was going. She begged Urania to forgive her because it was she who had recommended her to the old woman whom she was now suddenly leaving. And she told Mrs. Uxeley, without caring for her anger, her temper, or her words of abuse. She admitted that she was ungrateful, but there was a vital necessity which compelled her suddenly to leave Nice. She swore that it existed. She swore that it would mean unhappiness, even ruin, were she to stay. She explained it to Urania in a single sentence, but she did not explain it to the old woman, and left her in an impotent fury which made her writhe with rheumatic aches and pains. She left behind her everything that she had received from Mrs. Uxeley, all the superfluous wardrobe of her dependence. She put on an old frock. She went to the station like a criminal, trembling lest she should meet him. But she knew that at this hour he was always at Monte Carlo. Nevertheless, she went in a closed cab, and she took a second-class ticket for Florence. She telegraphed to Duco, and she fled. She had nothing left but him. She could never again count upon Mrs. Uxeley, and Urania had behaved coolly, not understanding that singular fright, because she did not understand the simple truth. Rudolph Brox's power. She thought that Cornélie was making things difficult for herself. In the circle in which Urania lived, her sense of social morality had wavered since her liaison with the Chevalier de Breuil. Hearing the Italian law of love whispered all around her, the law that love is as simple as an opening rose, she did not understand Cornélie's struggle. She no longer resented anything that Gilio did, and he in his turn left her free. What was happening to Cornélie? Surely it was all very simple. If she was still fond of her divorced husband, why should she run away to Duco and make herself ridiculous in the eyes of all their acquaintances? And so she had parted coolly from Cornélie, but still she missed her friend. She was the Princess di Forte Braccio, and lately, on her birthday, Prince Ercole had sent her a great emerald, out of the carefully kept family jewels, as though she were becoming worthy of them gradually, stone by stone. But she missed Cornélie, and she felt lonely, deadly lonely, notwithstanding her emerald and her lover. Cornélie fled. She had nothing in the world but Duco, but in him she would have everything, and, when she saw him at Florence, at the Santa Maria Novella station, she flung herself on his breast and clung to him as to a cross of redemption, a saviour. He led her sobbing to a cab, and they drove to his room. There she looked round her nervously. done up with the overstrain of her long journey, thinking every minute that Rudolph would come after her. She told Duco everything, opened her heart to him entirely, as though he were her conscience, as though he were her soul, her God. She nestled up against him. She told him that he must help her. It was as though she were praying to him. Her anguish went up to him like a prayer. He kissed her, and she knew that manner of comforting, she knew that tender caressing. She suddenly fell against him, utterly relaxed, and so she continued to lie, with closed eyes. It was as though she were sinking in a lake, in a blue sacred lake, mystic as the lake of San Stefano in the sleeping night, powdered with stars. And she heard him say that he would help her, that there was nothing in her fears, that that man had no power over her, that he would never have any power over her if she became his, Duco's wife. She looked at him and did not understand what he was saying. She looked at him feverishly, as though he had awakened her suddenly while she lay sleeping for a second in the blue calmness of the mystic lake. She did not understand, but, dead tired, she hid her face against his arm and again and fell asleep. She was dead tired. She slept for 2 hours immovably, breathing deeply upon his breast. When he shifted his arm, she just moved her head heavily, like a flower on a weary stalk, but she slept on. He stroked her forehead, her hair, and she slept on, with her hand in his. She slept as if she had not slept for days, for weeks. End of chapter 51. Chapter 52 of The Inevitable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Hawryluk. The Inevitable by COUPERUS. Translated by Alexander TEIXEIRA de MATTOS. The Inevitable, Chapter 52. There is nothing to be afraid of, Cornélie, he said, convincingly. That man has no power over you if you refuse with a firm will. I do not see what he could do. You are quite free, absolutely released from him. That you ran away so precipitately was certainly not wise. It will look to him like a flight. Why did you not tell him calmly that he can't claim any rights in you? Why did you not say that you loved me? If need were, you could have said that we were engaged. How can you have been so weak and so terrified? It's not like you. But now that you are here, all is well. We are together now. Shall we go back to Rome tomorrow, or shall we remain here a little first? I have always longed to show you Florence. Look there, in front of us, is the Arno. There is the Ponto Vecchio. There is the Uffizi. You've been here before, but you didn't know Italy then. You'll enjoy it more now. Oh, it's so lovely here. Let us stay a week or two first. I have a little money. You need have no fear. And life is cheaper here than in Rome. Living in this room we shall spend hardly anything. I have light enough through this window to sketch by now and again. Or else I go and work in the San Marco or in the San Lorenzo or up on the San Miniato. It's delightfully quiet in the cloisters. There are a few excursionists at times, but I don't mind that. And you can go with me, with a book about Florence. I'll tell you what to read. You must learn to know Donatello, Brunelleschi, Ghiberti, but above all, Donatello. We shall see him in the Bargello, and Lippo Mimi's Annunciation, the Golden Annunciation. You shall see how like our angel it is to it. Our beautiful angel of happiness, the one you gave me. It is so rich here, we shall not feel that we are poor. We need so little, or have you been spoiled by your luxury at Nice? But I know you so well. You will forget that at once, and we shall win through together. And presently we shall go back to Rome. But this time, married, my darling, and you belonging to me entirely, legally. It must be so now. You must not refuse me again. We'll go to the council tomorrow and ask what papers we want from Holland and what will be the quickest way of getting married. And meanwhile you must look upon yourself as my wife. Until now we have been very, very happy. But you are not my wife. Once you feel yourself to be my wife, even though we wait another fortnight for those papers to sign, you will feel safe and peaceful. There is nobody and nothing that has any power over you. You're not well, if you really think there is. And then, I'll bet you, when we are married, my mother will make it up with us. Everything will come right, my darling, my angel. But you must not refuse. We must get married with all possible speed." She was sitting beside him on a sofa and staring out of doors, where, in the square frame of the tall window, the slender campanelli rose like a marble lily between the dome-crowned harmonies of the cathedral and the Basterio, while on one side of the Palazzo Vecchio lay a massive battlement fortress amid the welter of the streets and roofs, and lifted its tower, suddenly expanding into the machicolated summit, with Fiesole and the hills shimmering behind it in the purple of the evening. The noble city of eternal grace gleamed a golden bronze in the last reflections of the setting sun. "We must get married at once?" she repeated, with a doubting interrogation. "Yes, as soon as ever we can, darling. But Duco, dearest Duco, it is less possible now than ever. Don't you see that it can't be done? It's impossible, impossible. It might have been possible before, some months ago, a year ago, perhaps not even then. Perhaps it was never possible. It is so difficult to say, but now it can't be done, really not. Don't you love me well enough? How can you ask me such a question? How can you ask me, darling? But it's not that. It can't be, because I'm not free." "Not free?" "I am not free. I may feel free later, or perhaps not, perhaps never. My dearest Duco, it is impossible. I wrote to you, you know, that first meeting at the ball. It was so strange. I felt that what?" She took his hand and stroked it. Her eyes were vague, her words were vague. "You see, he has been my husband." "But you're divorced from him, not merely separated, but divorced." "Yes, I'm divorced, but it's not that." "What then, dearest?" She shook her head and hid her face against him. "I can't tell you, Duco." "Why not? I'm ashamed. Tell me, do you still love him?" "No, it's not love. I love you." "But what then, my darling? Why are you ashamed?" She began to cry on his shoulder. "I feel—" "What?" "That I'm not free, although I am divorced. I feel that I am his wife all the same." She whispered the words almost inaudibly. "But then you do love him, and more than you love me." "No, no, I swear I don't." "But, darling, you're not talking sense." "Yes, indeed I am." "No, you're not. It's impossible." "It isn't. It's quite possible. And he told me so. And I felt it." "But the fellow's hypnotizing you." "No, it's not hypnotism. It's not a delusion. It's a reality. Deep, deep down within myself. Look here, you know me. You know how I feel. I love you and you only. That alone is love. I have never loved anyone else. I'm not a woman who is susceptible to. I'm not hysterical, but with him, no other man, no man whom I've ever met rouses that feeling in me, that feeling that I am not myself, that I belong to him, that I am his property, his chattel. She threw her arms about him. She hid herself like a child in his breast. It is so strange. You know me, don't you? I can be plucky and I am independent, and I have never at a loss for an answer. But with him I am no longer sure of myself. I no longer have a life of my own, and I do what he tells me to. But that is hypnotism. You can't escape that. If you seriously wish to, I will help you. It is not hypnotism. It is a truth deep down inside me. It exists inside me. I know that it is so, that it has to be so. Duco, it is impossible. I can't become your wife. I mustn't become your wife. Less now than ever. Perhaps what? Perhaps I always felt like that without knowing it. That it must not be, both for you and for me, and for him too. Perhaps that's what I felt without knowing it, when I talked as I used to, about my antipathy for marriage. But that antipathy arose from your marriage, with him. Yes, that's the strange part of it. I dislike him, and yet you're in love with him. Yet I belong to him. And you tell me that you love me? She took his head in her two hands. Try to understand. It tires me so, trying to make you understand. I love you, but I am his wife. Are you forgetting what you were to me in Rome? I was everything to you. Love, happiness, intense happiness. There was that most intense harmony between us. I shall never forget it. But I was not your wife. Not my wife. No, I was your mistress. I was unfaithful to him. Oh, don't repulse me. Pity me. Pity me. He had unconsciously made a gesture that frightened her. Let me stay like this, leaning against you, may I? I am so tired and I feel restful. Leaning against you like this, my darling, my darling, my darling. Things will never be as they were. What are we to do? I don't know, he said, in despair. I want to marry you as soon as may be. You won't consent. I can't. I mustn't. Then I don't know what to do or say. Don't be angry. Don't leave me. Help me. Do. I love you. I love you. I love you. She drew him into her arms in a close, sudden embrace, as though in perplexity and despair. He kissed her passionately in response. "Oh God, tell me what to do," she prayed, as she lay helplessly perplexed in his embrace. End of chapter 52. Chapter 53 of The Inevitable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Hawryluk. The Inevitable by COUPERUS. Translated by Alexander Teixeira de Mattos. The Inevitable. Chapter 53. Next day, when Cornélie walked with Duco through Florence, when they entered the courtyard of the Palazzo Vecchio, saw the Loggia di Lanzi, and looked in at the Uffizi to see Mimi's Annunciation, she felt something like her former sensations irresistibly unfolding within her. They seemed to have taken their lines which had burst asunder, and with human force to have bent them together again into one path, along which the white daisies and white lilies shot up with a tenderness of soft, mystic recognition that was almost like a dream. And yet it was not quite the same as before. An oppression as of a grey cloud hung between her and the deep blue sky, which hung out stretched like strips of aether, like paths of lofty quivering atmosphere, above the narrow streets, above the domes and towers and turrets. She no longer felt the former apprehension. There was a remembrance in her. A heavy pondering weighed upon her brain, an anxiety for what was about to happen. She had a presentiment as of a coming storm, and when, after their walk, they had had something to eat and went home, she dragged herself up the stairs to Duco's room more wearily than she had ever done in Rome. And she saw at once a letter lying on the table, a letter addressed to her. But how addressed? It gave her so violent a start that she began to tremble in every limb, and managed to thrust the letter away even before Duco had followed her into the room. She took off her hat and told Duco that she wanted to get something out of her trunk, which was standing in the passage. He asked if he could help her, but she said no and left the room and went into the narrow passage. Here, standing by the little window overlooking the Arno, she took out the letter. It was the only place where she could read for a moment undisturbed, and she read that address again, written in his hand, which she knew so well, with its great thick heavy characters. The name which she bore abroad was her maiden name. She called herself Madame de Retz van Loo, but on the envelope she read briefly, Baroni Blocks, 37 Lung Arno Tornegani, Florence. A deep crimson flush mantled over her face. She had borne that name for a year. Why did he call her by it now? Where was the logic in that title, which, by the law, was hers no longer? What did he mean by it? And, standing by the little window, she read his short but impervious letter. He wrote that he took her flight very much amiss, especially after their last conversation. He wrote that, at this last interview, she had granted him every right over her, that she had not denied it, and that, by kissing him and putting her arms around him, she had shown that she regarded herself as his wife, just as he regarded her as his wife. He wrote that he would not now resent her independent life of a year in Rome, because she was then still free, but that he was offended at her still looking upon herself as free, and that he would not accept the insult of her flight. He called upon her to return. He said that he had no legal right to do so, but that he did it because he nevertheless had a right which she could not dispute, which indeed she had not disputed, which on the contrary she had acknowledged by her kiss. He had learnt her address from the porter of the Villa Uxeley, and he ended by repeating that she was to return to Nice, to him, at the Hotel Continental, and telling her that, if she did not do this, he would come to Florence, and she would be responsible for the consequences of her refusal. Her knees shook. She was hardly able to stand upright. Should she show Duco the letter or keep it from him? She had to make up her mind then and there. He was calling to her from the room, asking what she was doing so long in the passage. She went in and was too weak to refrain from throwing herself on his breast. She showed him the letter, leaning against him, sobbing violently. She heard him fume and rage, saw the veins on his temples swell, saw him clench his fists and roll the letter into a ball and dash it to the floor. He told her not to be frightened, said that he would protect her. He too regarded her as his wife. It all depended upon the light in which she henceforth regarded herself. She did not speak, merely sobbed, broken with fatigue, with fright, with headache. She undressed and went to bed, her teeth chattering with fever. He drew her curtains to darken the room and told her to go to sleep. His voice sounded angry and she thought that he was angry at her lack of resolution. She sobbed and cried herself to sleep, but in her sleep she felt the terror within herself and again felt the irresistible pressure. While sleeping she dreamt of what she could reply and wrote to Brox. But it was not clear what she wrote. It was all a vague, impotent pleading for mercy. When she woke she saw Duco beside her bed. She took his hand. She was calmer. But she had no hope. She had no faith in the days that were coming. She looked at him and saw him gloomy, stern and self-contained, as she had never seen him before. Oh, their happiness was past. On that fatal day when he had seen her to the train in Rome, they had taken leave of their happiness. It was gone. It was gone. Gone the dear walks through the ruins and museums, the trips to the Frascati, Naples and Amalfi. Gone the dear, fond life of poverty in the big studio, among the gleaming colours of the old brocades and chasubles, of the old bronzes and silver. Gone the gazing together at his water-colours of the banners, she with her head on his shoulder, within his arm, living his art with him, enjoying his work with him. Gone the ecstasy of the night in the pergola, in the star-spangled night, with the sacred lake at their feet. Life was not to be repeated. They had tried in vain to repeat it here, in this room, at Florence, in the Palazzo Vecchio, tried in vain to repeat it even in the presence of Mimi's angel emitting his beam of light. They tried in vain to repeat their life, their happiness, their love. It was in vain that they had forced together the lines which had burst asunder. These had merely twined round each other for a moment, in a despairing curve. It was gone. It was gone. Gloomy and stern he sat beside her bed, and she knew it. She felt that he was powerless because she did not feel herself to be his wife, his mistress. Oh, she had felt that involuntary repulsion when she had uttered the word. Had he not always wanted to marry her? But she had always felt unconsciously that it could not be, that it must not be. Under all the exuberance of her acrid feministic phrases that had been the unconscious truth, she, railing against marriage, had always inwardly felt to be herself married, not by a signature, in accordance with the law, but according to an age-old law, a primeval right of man over woman, a law and a right of flesh and blood and the very marrow of the bones. Oh, above that immovable physical truth her soul had blossomed its blossom of white daisies and lilies. And that blossom also was the intense truth, the lofty truth of happiness and love. But the daisies and lilies blossomed and faded. The soul blossoms for but a single summer. The soul does not blossom for a lifetime. It blossoms perhaps before life. It blossoms perhaps after it. But in life itself the soul blossoms but for a single summer. It had blossomed. It was over. And in her body, which lived, in her being, which survived, she felt the truth in her very marrow. He was sitting beside her bed. But he had no rights, now that the lilies had blossomed. She was broken with pity for him. She took his hand and kissed it fervently and sobbed over it. He said nothing. He did not know how to say anything. It would all have been very simple for him if she had consented to be his wife. As things were, he could not help her. As things were, he saw his happiness foundering while he looked on. There was nothing to be done. It was slowly falling to pieces, like a crumbling ruin. It was gone. It was gone. She stayed in bed these days. She slept, she dreamt, she awoke again, and the dread waiting never left her. She had a slight temperature now and again, and it was better for her to stay in bed. As a rule, he remained by her side. But one day, when Duco had gone to the chemist for something, there was a knock at the door. She leaped out of bed, terrified lest she should see the man of whom she was always thinking. Half fainting with fright, she opened the door ajar. It was only the postman, with a registered letter from him. Even more curtly than the last time, he wrote that, immediately on the receipt of his letter, she was to telegraph, stating the day when she would come. He said that, if on such and such a day, he would calculate, etc., which, he did not receive her telegram, he would leave for Florence and shoot her lover like a dog at her feet. He would not take a moment to reflect. He did not care what happened. In this short letter his anger, his fury, raged like a red storm that lashed her across the face. She knew him, and she knew that he would do what he said. She saw, as in a flash, the terrible scene, with Duco dropping murdered, weltering in his blood. And she was no longer her own mistress. The red fury of that letter, dispatched from afar, made her his chattel, his thing. She had torn the letter open hastily before signing the postman's book. The man was waiting in the passage. Her brain whirled. The room spun before her eyes. If she paused to reflect, it would be too late to reflect. And she asked the postman nervously, "Can you send off a telegram for me at once?" No, he couldn't. It wasn't on his road. But she implored him to do it. She said that she was ill and that she must telegraph at once. And she found a gold 10-franc piece in her purse and gave it to him as a tip over and above the money for the telegram. And she wrote the telegram: "Leaving tomorrow, express train." It was a vague telegram. She did not know by what express. She had not been able to look it up. Would it be in the evening or quite early in the morning? She had no idea. How would she be able to get away? She had no idea. But she thought that the telegram would calm him. And she meant to go. She had no choice. Now that she had fled in despair, she saw it. If he wanted to have her back as his wife, she must go. If he had not wanted it, she could have remained, wherever she might be, despite her feelings that she belonged to him. But now that he wanted it, she must go back. But oh, how was she to tell Duco? She was not thinking of herself. She was thinking of Duco. She saw him lying before her in his blood. She forgot that she had no money left. Was she to ask for it? Oh God, what was she to do? She could not go next day, notwithstanding her telegram. She could not tell Duco that she was going. She had meant to slip quietly to the station when he was out. Or had she better tell him? Which would be the least painful? Or should she tell everything to Duco and run away somewhere with him and tell nobody where they were going? But supposing he discovered where they had gone, and he would find them, and then he would murder Duco. She was almost delirious with fear, with terror, with not knowing what to do, how to act. She now heard Duco's steps on the stairs. He came in, bringing her the pills, and, as usual, she told him everything, too weak, too tired to keep anything hidden, and showed him the letter. He blazed out furiously with hatred, but she fell on her knees before him and took his hands. She said that she had already sent the answer. He suddenly became cool, as though overcome by the inevitable. He said that he had no money to pay for her journey. Then, once more he took her in his arms, kissed her, begged her to be his wife, said that he would kill her husband, even as her husband had threatened to kill him. But she did nothing but sob and refuse, although she continued to cling to him convulsively. Then he yielded to the fatal omnipotence of life's silent tyranny. He felt death in his soul, but he wished to keep calm for her sake. He said that he forgave her. He held her, all sobbing, in his arms, because his touch calmed her, and he said that, if she wanted to go back, she despondently nodded yes. It was better to telegraph to Brock's again, asking for money for the journey and for clear instructions as to the day and time. He would do this for her. She looked at him through her tears in surprise. He himself drew up the telegram and went out. My darling, she thought as he went, as she felt the pain in his torn soul. She flung herself on the bed. He found her in hysterics when he returned. When he had tended her and tucked her up in bed, he sat down beside her and he said in a dead voice, My dearest, be calm now. The day after tomorrow I shall take you to Genoa. Then we shall take leave of each other forever. If it can't be otherwise, it must be like that. If you feel that it has to be, then it must be. Be calm now, be calm now. If you feel like that, then you must go back to your husband. Then perhaps you will not be unhappy with him. Be calm, dear, be calm. Will you take me? I shall take you as far as Genoa. I have borrowed the money from a friend. But above all, try to be calm. Your husband wants you back. He can't want you back only to beat you. He must feel something for you if he wants you so. And, if it has to be, then perhaps it will be the best thing for you, even though I can't see it in that light. He covered his face with his hands and, no longer master of himself, burst into sobs. She drew him to her breast. She was now calmer than he. And, as he sobbed with his head on her beating heart, she quietly stroked his forehead, while her eyes roamed distantly round the walls of the room. End of chapter 53. Chapter 54 of The Inevitable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Hawryluk. The Inevitable by COUPERUS. Translated by Alexander TEIXEIRA de MATTOS. The Inevitable, Chapter 54. She was now alone in the train. By tipping the guard lavishly, they had travelled by themselves through the night and been left undisturbed in their compartment. Oh, the melancholy journey, the last silent journey of the end. They had not spoken, but had sat close together, hand in hand, with eyes gazing into the distance before them, as though staring at the approaching point of separation. The dreary thought of that separation never left them, rushed onward in unison with the rattling train. Sometimes she thought of a railway accident and that it would be welcome to her if she could die with him. But the lights of the Genoa had gleamed up inexorably. Then the train had stopped, and he had flung out his arms and they had kissed for the last time. Pressed to his breast, she had felt all his grief within him. Then he had released her and rushed away, without looking round. She followed him with her eyes, but he did not look back, and she saw him disappear in the morning mist, pierced with little lights that hung about the station. She had seen him disappear among other people, swallowed up in the hovering mist. Then the silence and despairing surrender of her life had become so great that she was not able to weep. Her head dropped limply. Her arms hung lax. Like an inert thing she let the train bear her onward with its rending rattle. A white morning twilight had risen on the left over the brightening sea, and the dawning daylight tinted the water blue and defined the horizon. For hours and hours she travelled on, motionlessly, gazing out at the sea, and she felt almost painless with her impassive surrender of life. She would now let things happen as life willed, as her husband willed, as the train willed. As in the tired dream she thought of the inevitability of everything and all the unconscious life within herself, of her first rebellion against her husband's tyranny, of the illusion of her independence, the arrogance of her pride, and all the happiness of her gentle ecstasy, all the gladness because of the harmony which she had achieved. Now it was past. Now all self-will was vain. The train was carrying her to where Rudolph called her, and life hemmed her in on every side, not roughly, but with a soft pressure of phantom hands, which pushed and led and guided. And she ceased to think. The tired dream became clouded in the deeper blue of the day, and she felt that she was approaching Nice. She returned to the petty realities of life. She felt that she was looking a little travel-worn, and, feeling that it would be better if Rudolph did not see her for the first time in so unattractive a light, she slowly opened her bag, washed her face with her handkerchief, dipped in eau de cologne, combed her hair, powdered her face, brushed herself down, put on a transparent white veil, and took out a pair of new gloves. She bought a couple of yellow roses at a station and put them in her waistband. She did all this unconsciously, without thinking about it, feeling that it was best, that it was sensible to do it, best that Rudolph should see her like that, with that bloom of a beautiful woman about her. She felt that henceforth she must be above all beautiful, and that nothing else mattered. And when the train droned into the station, when she recognized Nice, she was resigned, because she had ceased to struggle and had yielded to all the stronger forces. The door was flung open and, in the station, which at that early hour was comparatively empty, she saw him at once. Tall, robust, easy, in his light summer suit, straw hat and brown shoes. He gave an impression of health and strength, and above all of broad-shouldered virility. And, notwithstanding his broadness, he was still quite thoroughbred, thoroughly well-groomed without the least touch of toppishness. And the ironical smile between his moustache and the steady glance of his fine grey eyes, the eyes of a woman-hunter, gave him an air of strength, of the certainty of doing as he wished, of the power to subdue if he thought fit, an ironic pride in his handsome strength, with a tinge of contempt for the others who were less handsome and strong, less of the healthy animal and yet the aristocrat, and above all a mocking, supercilious sarcasm directed against all women, because he knew women and knew how much they were really worth. All this was expressed by his glance, his attitude, his movements. It was thus that she knew him. It had often roused her to rebellion in the old days, but she now felt resigned and also a little frightened. He had come to her, he helped her to alight. She saw that he was angry, that he intended to receive her rudely, then that his moustache was curling ironically, as though in mockery because he was the stronger. She said nothing, however, took his hand calmly and alighted. He led her outside, and in the carriage they waited a moment for the trunk. His eyes took her in at a glance. She was wearing an old blue serge skirt and a little blue serge cape, but, notwithstanding her old clothes and her weary resignation, She looked a handsome and smartly dressed woman. "I am glad to see that you thought it advisable at last to carry out my wishes," he said in the end. "I thought it would be best," she answered softly. Her tone struck him, and he watched her attentively out of the corner of his eyes. He did not understand her, but he was pleased that she had come. She was tired now from excitement and travelling, but he thought that she looked most charming, even though she was not so brilliant as on that night at Mrs. Uxley's ball, when he had first spoken to his divorced wife. "Are you tired?" he asked. "I have been a bit feverish for a day or two, and of course I had no sleep last night," she said, as though in apology. The trunk was brought and they drove away to the Hotel Continental. She did not speak again in the carriage. They were also silent as they entered the hotel and in the lift. He took her to his room. It was an ordinary hotel bedroom, but she thought it strange to see his brushes lying on the dressing table, his coats and trousers hanging on the pegs, familiar things with whose outlines and folds she was quite well acquainted. She recognized his trunk in a corner. He opened the windows wide. She had sat down on the chair, in an expectant attitude. She felt a little faint and closed her eyes, which were blinded by the stream of sunlight. "You must be hungry," he said. "What shall I order for you?" "I should like some tea and bread and butter." Her trunk arrived and he ordered her breakfast. Then he said, "Take off your hat." She stood up. She took off her cape. Her cotton blouse was rumpled, and this annoyed her. She removed the pins from her hat before the glass and quite naturally did her hair with his comb, which she saw lying there, and she settled the silk bow around her collar. He had lit a cigar and was smoking quietly, standing. A waiter came in with the breakfast. She ate a mouthful without speaking and drank a cup of tea. "Have you breakfasted?" she asked. "Yes." They were silent again and she went on eating. "And shall we have a talk now?" he asked, still standing up, smoking. "Very well. I won't speak about your running off as you did," he said. "My first intention was to give you a regular flailing, for it was a damned silly trick." She said nothing. She merely looked up at him, and her beautiful eyes were filled with a new expression, one of gentle resignation. He felt silent again, evidently restraining himself and seeking his words. Then he resumed. "As I say, I won't speak about that any more. For the moment you didn't know what you were doing and you weren't accountable for your actions. But there must be an end of that now, for I wish it. Of course I know that according to the law I have not the least right over you. But we've discussed all that, and I told you in writing. And you have been my wife, and now I am seeing you again. I feel very plainly that, in spite of everything, I regard you as my wife and that you are my wife. And you must have retained the same impression from our meeting here at Nice." "Yes," she said calmly. "You admit that?" "Yes," she repeated. "Then that's all right. It's the only thing I wanted of you. So we won't think any more now of what happened, of our former unpleasantness, of our divorce and of what you have done since. From now on we will put all that behind us. I look upon you as my wife and you shall be my wife again. According to the law we can't get married again. But that makes no difference. Our divorce in law I regard as an intervening formality, and we will counter it as far as we can. If we have children we shall get them legitimized. I will consult a lawyer about all that. And I shall take all the necessary measures, financial included. In this way our divorce will be nothing more than a formality, of no meaning to us and of as little significance as possible to the world and to the law. And then I shall leave the service. I shouldn't in any case care to stay in it for good, so I may as well leave it earlier than I intended. For you wouldn't find it pleasant to live in Holland, and it doesn't appeal to me either." "No," she murmured. "Where would you like to live?" "I don't know." "In Italy?" "No," she begged in a tone of entreaty. "Care to stay here?" "I'd rather not, to begin with." "I was thinking of Paris. Would you like to live in Paris?" "Very well." "That's all right then. So we will go to Paris as soon as possible, and look out for a flat and settle in. It'll soon be spring now, and that is a good time to start life in Paris." "Very well." He flung himself in an easy chair. It creaked under him. Then he asked, "Tell me, what do you really think, inside yourself?" "How do you mean?" "I want to know what you thought of your husband. Did you think him absurd?" "No." "Come over here and sit on my knee." She stood up and went to him. She did as he wished, sat down on his knee, and he drew her to him. He laid his hand on her head with that gesture which prevented her thinking. She closed her eyes and laid her head against his cheek. "You haven't forgotten me altogether?" She shook her head. "We ought never to have got divorced, ought we?" She shook her head again. "But we used to be very bad-tempered then, both of us. You must never be bad-tempered in future. It makes you look spiteful and ugly. As you are now, you're much nicer and prettier." She smiled faintly. "I am glad to have you back with me," he whispered, with a long kiss on her lips. She closed her eyes under his kiss, while his moustache curled against her skin and his mouth pressed hers. "Are you still tired?" he asked. "Would you like to rest a little?" "Yes," she said. "I would like to get my things off." "You'd better go to bed for a bit," he said. "Oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you. Your friend, the princess, is coming here this evening." "Isn't Urania angry?" "No, I have told her everything and she knows about it all." She was pleased to know that Urania was not angry and that she still had a friend left. "And I have seen Mrs. Uxeley also. She must be angry with me, isn't she?" He laughed. "That old hag. No, not angry. She's in the dumps because she has no one with her. She set great store by you. She likes to have pretty people about her, she said. She can't stand an ugly companion, with no chic. There, get undressed and go to bed. I'll leave you and go and sit downstairs somewhere." They stood up. His eyes had a golden glimmer in them. His moustache was lifted by his ironic smile, and he caught her fiercely in his arms. "Cornélie," he said hoarsely, "I think it's wonderful to have you back again. Do you belong to me? Tell me, do you belong to me?" He pressed her to him till he almost stifled her with the pressure of his arms. "Tell me, do you belong to me?" "Yes." "What did you used to say to me in the old days, when you were in love with me?" She hesitated. "What did you used to say?" he insisted, holding her still more tightly. Pushing her hands against his shoulders, she fought to catch her breath. "Mr. Rudd," she murmured. "My beautiful, glorious Rudd." Automatically she now wound her arms around his head. He released her as with an effort of will. "Take off your things," he said, "and try to get some sleep. I'll come back later." He went away. She undressed and brushed her hair with his brushes, washed her face and dripped into the basin some of the toilet water which he used. She drew the curtains, behind which the noonday sun shone, and a soft crimson twilight filled the room, and she crept into the great bed and lay waiting for him, trembling. There was no thought in her. There was in her no grief and no recollection. She was filled only with a great expectancy, a waiting for the inevitability of life. She felt herself to be solely and wholly a bride, but not an innocent bride, and, deep in her blood, in the very marrow of her bones, she felt herself to be the wife, the very blood and marrow, of him whom she awaited. Before her, as she lay half dreaming, she saw little figures of children. For, if she was to be his wife in truth and sincerity, she wanted not to be only his lover, but also the woman who gave him his children. She knew that, despite his roughness, he loved the softness of children, and she herself would long for them, in her second married life, as a sweet comfort for the days when she would be no longer beautiful and no longer young. Before her, half dreaming, she saw the figures of children. And she lay waiting for him. She listened for his steps. She longed for his coming. Her flesh quivered towards him. And, when he entered and came to her, her arms closed round him in profound and conscious certainty, and she felt, beyond a doubt, on his breast, in his arms, the knowledge of his virile, overmastering dominion, while before her eyes, in a dizzy melancholy obscurity, the dream of her life, Rome, Duco, the studio, sank away. End of chapter 54. End of The Inevitable by Louis COUPERUS, translated by Alexander Teixeira de Mattos.